Victorian home was a place of sanctuary from the outside world, especially in the cities where dirt and disease hung in the air and danger stalked the streets. And thanks to advances in science, a whole host of products and services were promising to make life at home cheaper, easier, and more convenient. But they were also making life much more dangerous. For under the guise of family-friendly products, mass consumption was bringing killers into the very heart of the Victorian home. With the aid of modern science, I'll seek out the deadly assassins that hid on every floor.
Leaning too close to the fire and poof, they burst into flames.
I'll be revealing what the Victorians couldn't see inside their homes.
5 grams is sufficient to potentially kill a small child.
And showing the terrible injuries that were inflicted in the name of progress.
That could completely remove the skin from the hand and the arm.
Welcome back to the perilous world of the real Victorian home. Between 1800 and 1900, the urban population in Britain increased tenfold. London became the biggest industrial city in the Western world. City dwellers in houses like this were creating an unprecedented demand for mod cons as well as life's necessities. They were becoming mass consumers at the end of a production line. Supplying the household with basic foods in the newly expanded cities of up to 3 million people was a strategic challenge. But thankfully, by the late 19th century, the staples of bread and milk had become cheaply available. To cater for the new demands, the Victorians pioneered new food processing techniques. This left the consumer at the mercy of the unscrupulous merchants responsible for each part of the food chain.
One thing that the Victorians loved above all was profit, and the way to make profit, of course, is to use the cheapest ingredients and charge a high price for them. So adulteration became very popular throughout the Victorian period.
Some merchants would substitute real ingredients with cheap alternatives that would add weight and increase profit margins. Food adulteration had always gone on, but the new manufacturing process meant it was now big business.
The food shops themselves change as well, so you used to have a system whereby, for example, with bread, the miller was the same as the baker, was the same as the retailer. Now, the miller mills the flour, passes it to the baker bakes, and the retailer sells. So you've got divorcing all the way along the chain. That depersonalises the food chain. People don't have the personal relationship with their customers, therefore they think they can get away with it. Anything that is made, manufactured, or passes through the hands of somebody who can adulterate it, by the mid-Victorian period, the chances are it will be adulterated.
These additions were astounding. Chalk, iron sulfate, and even plaster of Paris. But for many, buying processed foods released them from the drudgery of baking, was time-saving, and above all, was affordable. Bread was particularly susceptible to tampering, as many things could be disguised in it.
The biggest adulterant at the time was alum, and that's been used since the 18th century. It's a whitener. What it does is it enables you to take seconds or middlings or the lower grades of flour, make them look whiter.
Alum is an aluminium-based compound, often found today in detergent. But when hidden in bread, it not only makes it whiter, but retains water, so the bread feels more substantial.
In theory, the amounts used were quite small, and in theory, they were not particularly dangerous to health. But when you've got both the miller adding alum and then you've got the baker adding alum as well, then you start to build up the dose to levels where it really will affect your bowel system.
Food historian Annie Gray has prepared 3 loaves for me to illustrate the choice I would have had as a Victorian housewife. Whilst one loaf is pure, 2 of them have plaster of Paris, alum and other undesirables added to them.
And which is which?
Well, you're the Victorian housewife, so I would say you're in the baker's and you're presented with these loaves. Which one would you pick?
Well, they all look very attractive, which is slightly worrying. It's really quite dense, though, isn't it? It's quite heavy. So listen to that. This one's still quite dense, but again, looks nice and smells really like rubber or something. Very odd. That smells fine. This is lighter. Smells more like bread that I'm familiar with. So my guess is that this one is fine.
Yes, it is. Although it's interesting the way perception plays a role. Part of the reason that you're preferring that one, I suspect, is because we are predisposed now to like granary breads and things that look healthy. Whereas with your Victorian hat on, you should be looking for the bread that is whitest and therefore will impress your dinner guests.
So I would probably be looking not to go for something wholemeal that looks healthy today, but something like this.
Yes. In the Victorian period, people really want white bread. It's the current obsession with wholemeal, granary, beautiful artisanal loaves. Nothing. You want white bread. So alum is a whitener that's put in.
And which is which in terms of these two? Which is the one, what's got what?
This one is the alum-based one, and this one is the one with plaster of Paris and bean flour. From a baker's point of view, this one's brilliant because a third of the dry solids in this are not pure flour. So you're making a reasonable saving on even the sort of low-grade flour that you're using.
But this housewife's choice had dire consequences for the consumer.
If you were a worker eating 2 pounds of bread a day and not much else, when you consider that a third of what you're eating just won't benefit you at all, you can see why chronic malnutrition is such an issue. And when your adulterants are things like plaster of Paris and alum, you can also see why chronic gastritis is a problem in late Victorian England. If you're in a workhouse and you're a 3-year-old, you're going to start off with constipation, you're then going to have irregular bowel movements, and then that will lead to diarrhoea. And if you are a 3-year-old in a workhouse and you've got chronic diarrhoea, that will lead to death.
Another reason for adulteration was a desire to make food more attractive and appealing. Colour was a key component.
And so there were things like colourants. You might have something like lead chromate, which is a very vivid yellow colour. In fact, it's the yellow that's used in the paint of American school buses. It's that really bright yellow. And that was put in things like mustard to give it an authentic mustard colour without having to actually include too much of the real ingredient, which was expensive.
Tea is adulterated with everything, from iron filings to dust to used tea leaves, and then black lead to make it look black. Green tea has Prussian blue in it. I mean, they're pretty lethal.
Sir Arthur Hill Hassall, a London-based physician, identified adulteration in 2,500 products and published his results in The Lancet. This led to the first wave of legislation in 1868.
The food adulteration laws were not very strong when they were initially put in, and they were not particularly effective either. People simply continued because it was very difficult to police, it was very difficult to prove.
And even after it is known about, even after Ackham and Hassall start to publicise the food adulteration, people just simply don't know what adulterated food looks like versus non-adulterated food. So you might know that your bread is probably adulterated, but either you don't have a choice or you just assume blithely that it happens to other people.
Bread adulteration might ultimately kill you because of malnutrition, but there was a greater, more immediate danger that was part of every child's diet. For the Victorians, milk was a cheap and important source of calcium, a healthy food, it was thought. However, in 1882, 20,000 milk samples were tested and revealed that 1/5 had been adulterated. A clue as to what was going on came from the domestic goddess of her day, Mrs. Beeton.
The Victorians sought advice on all manner of things, and when it came to food, Mrs. Beeton was their guru.
According to the 1888 edition of her Book of Household Management, milk, she said, could be purified by preparations of which the principal constituent is boracic acid. And, she adds, it is said that most of the milk that comes to London is treated in this way. She concludes, fortunately for the consumer, it is a quite harmless addition.
But was it as harmless as Mrs. Beeton believed? Microbiologist Matthew Avison has devised an experiment that tests Mrs. Beeton's advice. Boracic acid was a component of a product called borax, an alkali which was used during the Victorian period to prolong the life of milk.
This milk doesn't taste very nice, so you would throw it away. The Victorians would say that's a waste, so let's do something to it that removes the sour taste. And what they would have done is added alkalis.
When fresh, milk has a neutral pH measurement of around 7. But over time, as it sours or spoils and becomes contaminated with bacteria, it becomes more acidic and its pH measurement drops.
So the Victorians worked out, probably by trial and error, that if you add alkali to this, it would neutralise the acid. Then I've calculated that that will neutralise the acid in this milk. So we just give it a little bit of a shake, and then we'll show, hopefully, that it gives a pH closer to neutral. So you can see this has gone back to 6.6, which is approximately neutral. It's neutralised the acid. It's now made this milk palatable again.
This new wonder alkali, sold in the shops as borax, was so popular it became a staple of the Victorian larder. But alarmingly, borax wasn't only used to treat milk. It was also marketed as a wonderfully versatile product, as I found when I read the journals of the time. I'm just looking at these ads in The Sketch from 1893, and there's this absolutely extraordinary one-page ad, Californian household treasure. It says it's absolutely pure and absolutely safe. It possesses qualities that are exceptional and unknown to any other substance, and it purifies water, destroys bacteria, it promises everything. In fact, borax promised too much. As well as purifying milk, it was brilliant at cleaning your bath and your loo. So what happened when borax ended up in the body?
Borax, or sodium borate, if inhaled or ingested, can cause severe irritation. So if it's swallowed, it can cause abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. If you have a large amount of it, it will start to affect other organs like the brain and the kidneys. And if you have enough, it can prove fatal.
But just how much borax is harmful?
I've added a small amount of borax to neutralise the acid in this milk, but of course if you had a pint of milk, you'd need more borax. So I calculated that you need this much borax to neutralise a pint of milk that's gone sour. This is 5 grams, and according to some people, 5 grams is sufficient to potentially kill a small child.
So the addition of borax was not as harmless as Mrs. Beeton suggested. Enough of it could kill. But by reducing the acid in the spoiled milk and disguising the sour taste, borax was concealing another deadly threat.
The real problem is it doesn't get rid of the bacteria, the underlying cause of the acid, and those bacteria could still kill people. Bacteria like Brucella, which causes undulating fever. It's a nasty fever that can go on for weeks at a time. That's not particularly lethal, but what would be lethal would be TB.
The bovine TB bacterium is present in cow's milk, and this was what was able to flourish undetected in the milk, with devastating effects.
Bovine TB. It's not the same TB that would cause the coughing symptoms that we associate with TB, but what's called non-pulmonary TB. It spreads out into the extremities, includes damage to internal organs, damage to the bones, and particularly problematic in children.
What other effects could drinking milk contaminated with the bovine TB bacterium have?
Bovine TB could also cause damage to the bones and the spine. For example, it could cause an abscess in the bones of the spinal column, which would soften the bone, which would then collapse to form a wedge shape. And if several of these vertebrae collapsed at once, it could cause massive deformity of the spine. This woman was actually particularly lucky because her TB damaged only the bones of the spine and not the spinal cord itself. If the abscess had tracked and burst backwards into the spinal column, it would have compressed the spinal cord and caused paralysis at best or death at worst.
Effectively purifying this according to the standards of Mrs. Beaton is like removing the biohazard tape, and now it's basically pot luck as to whether we have something that's contaminated and could kill us, or something that's not contaminated and is safe to drink.
Adding borax to milk allowed bovine TB bacteria to grow undetected, exposing a generation to a lethal infectious disease.
It's estimated that virtually all children were exposed to bovine TB at some time during their upbringing, and it's known that many of those children succumbed to that infection.
So you're saying that hundreds of thousands of people, mostly perhaps children, died as a result of that?
There are many studies, one of which, for example, was a series of postmortems done in London in the 1890s, and they did postmortems on 1,300 children who had died. 30% of those children died as a result of TB. Non-pulmonary TB, almost certainly that came from milk. Now, if you extrapolate that up, it's considered likely that 500,000 children died of TB from milk during the Victorian era.
Despite these horrendous deaths, the purification of milk with alkali was not banned by legislation in the Victorian period, and the problem of adulterated food continued until gradually consumer pressure led manufacturers to advertise their wares as pure and unadulterated.
The next hidden killer lies not in the room, but between the levels of the Victorian house.
The dangers weren't just a result of products introduced into the home. They were built into the very fabric of the new Victorian houses. One of the most common death traps was right under their feet.
Stairs have always been dangerous. Even with today's building regulations, at least 300,000 accidents occur every year in the UK. But in Victorian times, it was even worse.
There's numerous accounts of people falling down staircases and breaking their necks, or breaking a leg and dying later of septicemia.
Why were there so many deaths and injuries from stairs? The finger points to the urban population boom. The number of Victorians per square mile increased from 390 in 1871 to 558 by 1901. Houses were thrown up and packed into smaller plots with little concern about regulation or standardisation.
The problem is the way that the house styles changed. Houses become very much more narrow. So what you've got is very high ceilings, 10, 11 feet, with a very narrow frontage. It's a straightforward geometrical problem, as if you've got 11 foot and only a very short space to get into it. The staircase has to be steep.
In middle-class homes, the stairs that were most likely to be cheaply constructed, to be the steepest and the narrowest, were those that led to the servant quarters.
Upstairs, downstairs came from the difference in staircases, from the decorated staircase, which was the main one in the house, which was there as a show of wealth. It was a statement to say, look, this is how much money I've got. As you came through the front door, and there's this wonderful double bullnose stairs, highly decorated with spindles and volutes and balustrades and goosenecks. You had people spending thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds on these staircases. And then the downstairs staircase was for the servants. It was built out of the cheapest softwood that you could possibly buy. You'd be lucky if there was handrails and spindles, rises of 9, 10, 12 inches. Safety really wasn't high on the agenda.
Tragic, really, because by 1847, visionary builder Peter Nicholson had calculated how to build a safer staircase, transforming the art of stair building into a science.
He came up with a mathematical formula for working out the rise and go of a staircase. He'd worked out that if you went up a certain height, you could travel a certain distance with great ease, and he developed a formula around that.
In order that people may pass freely, the length of the step ought never to be less than 4 feet. Though in townhouses, for want of room, the going of the stair is frequently reduced to 2.5 feet.
Nicholson's formula considered how someone could take a normal stride, yet still allow them to rise 6 to 8 inches with every step.
Until you get those factors right, then the stairs is always going to be a dangerous place.
There's a science to stair building, but in the rush to throw up houses, it was a science that was often overlooked in the late Victorian period.
I've come to Manchester Metropolitan University to see what modern science can tell us about the dangers of the Victorian stairs. I've been wired up to a motion capture device which will track every step I take to find out how my body adapts to the stairs. Professor Kostas Manganaris
OK, so I'm just going to clip you into the harness.
And Professor Neil Reeves are experts in biomedical research and are going to demonstrate 2 staircases.
We'd like you to go to the top of the staircase, stand facing this way, and just walk down at your own comfortable speed, as you would normally.
This first staircase has been set to dimensions similar to a main Victorian staircase, following Nicholson's principles. The going, or width, of each step has been set to 11 inches, and the height, the rise, to 12.5 inches.
Well, apart from all the get-up, it felt pretty easy coming down those stairs. I'd feel pretty happy running up and down those, no problems at all.
Now they set the stairs as they might have been in the servants' quarters.
Forwards one.
This definitely breaks Nicholson's formula,
Yeah, OK, we'll leave you there.
with the going narrower and a steeper rise.
So can you walk down as you would normally?
Predictably, this is not comfortable at all. In fact, I'm really having to slow down, change the way I take each step, and hold the handrail. Imagine if I had to carry a tray or the linen and couldn't see where my foot fell because of a long skirt.
If we measure your foot, this is about 26 centimeters, which is much larger than the 17.5 centimeters room you had.
I had to turn it sideways.
You decided to turn it sideways.
Well, otherwise, one's foot's coming off the edge.
Otherwise, what would happen, an important part of the foot would come out of the edge, and then you would have an increased likelihood of encountering a slip.
Yes, yes. And I've fallen downstairs before, so I was very conscious of not wanting to do it.
Absolutely.
From the data input, the scientists reveal that on the servants' staircase, we are 6 times more likely to fall than on the ground one. It may seem obvious that a steeper staircase would be more dangerous, but there was another hidden danger. Many Victorian homes were built with non-uniform steps. This video of a New York subway stairs illustrates what happens when one stair out of 16 is a fraction of an inch higher than the others. Professor Jake Pauls, a specialist in stair safety, studied the stairs and worked out that this tiny change has a dramatic impact on the misstep and fall incidence that is not equated to any other stair defect. In other words, you're more likely to fall if the stair is not uniform than for any other reason.
What is it about that video? What does it tell us?
Well, I think what it tells us is that people get used to a very regular stair pattern very quickly, so after a few steps. And if all of a sudden you introduce a step which is very different, it poses difficulties for people. And this is why it's more likely to for someone to have an accident or to slip on that irregular step.
So if you'd given me 2 that were the bigger ones and then a smaller one, I almost certainly would have fallen down.
Exactly.
Thank you for not doing that.
By disregarding Nicholson's formula, the Victorians' new staircases, installed in many of these narrower houses, had unwittingly combined high rises, narrow goings, and uneven steps to create a grave hazard for the servants.
With the extra weight of carrying trays and food, there's no way that they could get up and down those stairs in one piece. Total death traps, absolute death traps.
Stairs remain one of the most common sources of accident and death in the home. To understand our next set of dangers, we need to appreciate one of the major preoccupations of our Victorian forebears.
It was at this time that cleanliness was becoming powerfully linked to ideas of morality and respectability, and this is reflected in the literature of the period. Charles Kingsley's novel The Water Babies epitomises it because it suggests you could take a dirty boy off the street and transform him into a model gentleman through the cleansing power of water. It sums it up in the last lines. They say, "Meanwhile, do you learn your lessons and thank God that you have plenty of cold water to wash in, and wash in it too, like a true Englishman."
The Victorians were totally and utterly obsessed with being clean. For them, cleanliness was truly next to godliness. They were setting themselves against the 18th century, which was a time of dirt, which was a time in the upper classes that perfume was used to disguise dirt. The Victorians believed that a clean heart, a clean body, meant a clean soul.
It was this desire for cleanliness that would lead the Victorians to embrace a whole new range of potentially deadly innovations and products.
One of the rooms the Victorians can claim to have invented is the bathroom. And what surer sign of progress than a private room in which to carry out one's ablutions?
The bathroom really appears primarily because running water comes into the home for the first time. So if you can actually bring water into the home, it becomes more practical to have a room dedicated to its use.
Until the mid-Victorian period, hot tubs for bathing had stood next to the fire in the front room or kitchen, where water had to be warmed and poured into them.
This means that servants no longer have to be sort of traipsing up and down the back stairs carrying large amounts of water. And I think this is when the bathroom, as we know it, as a sort of separate, private, lockable space away from the rest of the house, really starts to take shape.
What the Victorians hated most of all was the idea of bodily fluids, the kind of smells they made, the kind of traces they left. They wanted to expunge them entirely from the body so that no one can smell the traces of these fluids that link you to the working classes.
So where does the collection come from? Well, mostly it's given to us by different people.
And what happened happened in this private lockable space could be incredibly dangerous. I've come to Blaise Castle in Bristol to meet curator Catherine Littlejohns. I want to get some idea of the inventions available to the Victorians who sought to meet these new high standards of cleanliness.
Oh, wow. We're just going to look at some of the baths in the collection. I'm going to show you one of my favourite things. It's actually a gas-powered bath. So if we have a look at the underneath here, you can see where the gas went in at the front here, and then just around by you there's a little door, which is where you would light the gas.
OK, so here you'd put in your lighted match or whatever.
Yeah.
Gosh, so that's actually ridiculously dangerous, isn't it? Doesn't it mean that you can boil yourself in your bath?
You very probably could do. The instructions, the guidance always says they're very careful to point out that you don't want to actually start turning the gas on until you've actually got some water in the bath, so you don't boil it dry. They don't really make a mention of making sure you don't get into the bath while the gas is on.
The desire to be clean meant that the bath's popularity outpaced any concern about the dangers, which were significant. The papers regularly reported cases of scalding so serious they resulted in death. It wasn't until the invention of the thermostat, safe for gas, and its installation that these risks would be addressed. This new room, with its cutting-edge innovations, would bring even more killers into the home.
I think they were trying to understand the dangers of electricity and water and gas and all these new services coming into fairly small, confined areas without really understanding the dangers of how they actually interact with each other.
What could be better or more desirable than having a loo that flushed? But its introduction was not without problems. The first danger lay in the plumbing.
Early plumbing in Victorian houses, the sewer systems didn't efficiently drain away the waste.
Gases such as methane and hydrogen sulfide emanating from human waste would not be able to escape and would build up in the sewer.
Both of these gases are not only flammable, but they're also explosive.
What always used to happen was the sewerage outlet would get blocked and somebody would have to go and figure out how to clear it to get it to actually run away free. At the time, there wasn't electric batteries, torches and stuff like that, so the only way you could actually go and investigate it was unfortunately with a naked flame.
Not only could gas collect in the sewer, methane could actually leak back into the house itself.
It's quite a common occurrence, there's that outlets of toilets to spontaneously combust. And that was really where the drive towards improvements in drainage actually came from, because they needed to stop methane getting back into the houses.
And it was one of Britain's most famous inventors that helped put a stop to this potential killer with one small but crucial component.
Thomas Crapper, even though he gets a lot of good press about inventing the toilet, he actually invented the siphon valve, which is actually a water trap and a valve flap which actually stops methane coming back into the property, so it couldn't ignite. It didn't stop the problem down in the main sewers, but it stopped it actually affecting the people who lived in the house.
Not only were Victorian bodies subject to a new regime of washing and scrubbing, but what they put on them was too. Wealthy Victorians, both men and women, could change their clothes up to 5 times a day.
By the late Victorian period, laundry had become a huge operation because clothing was not simple. There was an extensive amount of clothing, even for a child, and certainly for a woman. She wore a lot of underclothing, a lot of linen, and these had to be changed regularly. The Victorian mistress had a constant battle against her greatest enemy, which was dirt.
The Victorian house could not escape the pollution of the time. In London, for instance, the manure of the 100,000 working horses, the pervasive smog, and the smoky gas lamps in the home all took their toll.
Victorian wash day was quite a mammoth task. I mean, you washed the clothes on the Monday, you dried them on the Tuesday, and you would be ironing them on the Wednesday, so a large part of your week would be taken up by the wash.
Doing the laundry was an expensive business and a major part of the household budget. For those who could afford it, a laundress could be hired in by the day. It was a military-style operation.
Every Victorian middle-class woman came to her marriage with great trunks full of white clothing, linen, and her big job throughout her marriage was keeping those just as brilliantly white, and what she used in this endeavour were soaps, disinfectants, and most of all, she used the mangle.
So I've just fed this in from the back here, and you just have to get it so that it's between the rollers.
Bringing out heavy fabrics sodden in boiling water became easier with the arrival of the mangle.
It's not too heavy because of the gear system, and of course this is dry, so if you were doing it with wet clothing...
But of course this brought its own perils.
But why is it so dangerous? I mean, it seems really quite solid.
I think it's probably like a lot of Victorian contraptions where, yes, it is very solid, but you've got kind of exposed gear wheels and things, and obviously you have to feed the clothing in. And what you have to remember is that the lady of the house, she would have been doing this with young children around. Her daughters would have been watching her because they needed to learn how to work these things, and often probably in quite a confined space.
Oh, the dangers of little fingers, I mean, you know.
Possibly.
The injuries incurred by wash day mangle accidents were horrific and sometimes fatal.
Oh, a mangle could do an awful lot of damage, particularly to a child, and of course it was typically children who would put their hand out of curiosity into the mangle. Obviously, the hand, the arm, and it typically was the upper limb that was caught, would be compressed and everything in it would be squashed, and a significant proportion would have fractures of the bones as well as damage to the soft tissue. There was a shearing force where you were pulling the skin in opposite directions, and that could completely remove the skin from the hand and the arm and tear it all away to reveal the muscles and tendons underneath.
Mr. Barham, surgeon, found the child pale, pulseless, and partially paralysed, and with the parental bones on either side of his head smashed in.
The dangers of the mangle might seem obvious to us now, but our next hidden killer was impossible to see both then and now.
Things couldn't just look clean. The new science of germs and microbes was changing ideas of cleanliness, from tackling the visible to the invisible. Dangerous germs, they feared, could lurk hidden from sight and needed to be eradicated.
Until the late Victorian period, many believed that diseases were caused and carried by bad air. But with improvements in technology and the emergence of high-powered microscopes, bacteria began to be identified as the cause of disease. But this science was brand new and not easily understood by the general public.
There are various theories around the origins of disease at this point. They're quite confused about it. They've started to be aware of germ theory, but this isn't fully understood yet.
What they did understand was that there were microbes all around, invisible to the eye, but everywhere. And this made the Victorians disproportionately fearful and easily spooked.
Some mothers didn't want to kiss their children because they thought it would spread germs. So this is very real and comes up again and again in diaries. The fact that people were afraid of each other because of germs, which is a horrific thing when you think about it.
As this climate of fear escalated, so people became increasingly alarmed about all manner of little things.
One of the most important things apart from germs was flies. The great fly scare of the 1890s.
The Great Fly Scare was caused by public awareness of the speed with which flies could spread germs. Flies were everywhere, living off the horse manure and trampled into the home. Once scientists identified flies as carriers of disease, the public reacted.
They realised that one of the main communicators of germs were probably flies, with their little sticky feet walking over everything. And once you started to look at flies like that, they became objects of horror.
The terrors of insects and moths and caterpillars that need to be sternly exterminated because they just show the natural world coming into your perfect home.
Also, skirts. Not strictly speaking anything to do with flies, except if you noticed when you walked around with a long skirt on, that you would be brushing up against the feces and the horse manure and everything else. And that was likely to bring fly eggs in or anything. So skirt length went up to ankles.
Once skirts went up, the shutters came down on flies in the home, with a variety of products invented to stop them.
You have fly screens, you have little lace doilies over your milk jugs, you have little lace doilies everywhere, really. You cover your curtains with lace to stop flies coming in, not really so that you can not see out. All of these things were partly to do with the fly scare.
But the fight against germs would require more than beaded doilies. The Victorians needed to believe that these germs were being eradicated by newly invented products that would kill all known germs dead.
Many claims were made in the name of science before these items could be rigorously tested, making the late Victorian home a very scary place to be.
And the Victorians worshipped science, they worshipped invention, so they would do anything to make things cleaner, even if that meant using dangerous chemicals.
But as the incredible cleaning powers of these new items became more potent, so the dangers in the home increased.
The problem was that many cleaning products are toxic, and they have to be. That's how they have their cleaning effects. But they were stored and sold in very similar packages. So you would go to the shop and get a box that contained something like baking soda, which we would use to bake bread or cakes and is perfectly harmless, but it may look very similar to the box of caustic soda, which of course is very corrosive and would do a huge amount of damage to the body.
Dangerous chemicals such as caustic soda and carbolic acid were now in the cupboard next to the flour and sugar and were easily muddled. The opportunity for mistakes and mix-up between products was huge. Drinking bleach or carbolic acid, for example, would lead to an agonizing death.
The first thing that would happen would be a burning sensation in the esophagus because it is directly corrosive to anything that it comes in contact with. And so that would go down into the stomach and cause abdominal pain. In the early stages, if the person survives and they don't go into renal failure, they may develop strictures because of scarring of the esophagus, meaning that they're unable to swallow any food. And of course, that could prove fatal.
This lack of distinction in bottles and packaging of toxic cleaning materials and dangerous substances didn't just confuse the Victorian at home. There were cases where even professionals made mix-ups with disastrous consequences. On one occasion in Bradford, a chemist mistakenly mixed arsenic into his lozenge recipe, killing 12 people and rendering a further 78 seriously ill.
And so it was this problem with the packaging that really forced legislation to make packages much more distinct, so different shaped and sized and coloured bottles and boxes, so that you couldn't reach for the flour and pick up the arsenic, for example.
But it wasn't always an accident. Lethal poisons of all descriptions were easily and readily available over the counter. With this lay a new temptation, because poisoning could go undetected.
Victorian age was the age of the poisoner. The rise of arsenic was to many people a great opportunity. Previously, if you wanted to murder someone, you'd have to use your brute strength. You'd have to stab them or strangle them. When arsenic became widely available, there was a lot of comment in the newspaper saying, well, women could just slip it into their husband's tea, so why wouldn't they? They were absolutely afraid that all the women in Britain would turn poisoner, because why would you not murder your husband and go off and be a merry widow? Why not?
People bought poisons for things like rat poisoning and fly papers, so you could easily just go and buy them for completely legitimate reasons. The other reason was this is a time when life insurance became available, and so you could take out a life insurance policy on one of your family members, and then if they die, you could claim the money. And there's evidence there were quite a few unscrupulous people who took out large policies before people mysteriously died. There were many poisons around, things like arsenic, but probably the worst and the one that caused the most awful death was strychnine.
Strychnine could be used both as a medicine and in the garden as a pesticide. A white odourless powder, it was like so many other items in the cupboard.
It has very immediate and unpleasant effects. First of all, the muscles of the head and the neck would start to contract, and then spasm would spread to all the muscles of the body. The person would start to convulse, and at its worst, the muscles of the body would be so contracted that the person would be resting on just their heels and their head, with their back bowed in the middle and unable to move. Death would follow rapidly, either because of paralysis of the respiratory muscles, which meant that they couldn't breathe, or exhaustion following all these awful convulsions.
Demand had never been higher, and manufacturers had never sold so many poisonous products. It would take a long time for that to change.
It wasn't until just after the Victorian age, in 1902, that the Pharmacy Act required that bottles of disinfectant be distinguishable by touch from bottles in which ordinary liquids were contained.
In order to find the next hazard, we must first understand the temptations on offer to the middle-class Victorian.
Could this be a hidden killer? Manufacturers began to woo a burgeoning mass market. This was the first age of mass advertising. Back in the 1850s and 1860s, it had been thought ungentlemanly to advertise. Now, for the first time, advertising became powerfully visual. Photography and art were used to sell goods. Advertising agencies were founded, and celebrities started to endorse products.
There's an expansion in print culture. There are more newspapers, there are more magazines, but there are also new technologies and ways of producing images and putting them in them. For example, photographs appear in magazines from the 1890s onwards, and this really means that advertising takes on a new visual form at this point, and I think it becomes more persuasive and more powerful.
The power of advertising put new pressure on Victorians and would lead to increased risks.
And these advertisements are particularly aimed at the upper class and the middle class woman. And what they're trying to say is, if you don't buy our products, if you don't use our products, you will be a failure as a housewife, as a woman. So they really played on insecurities. And what they did was they got everyone to buy all kinds of dangerous substances under the guise of perfecting your home.
And the perfect Victorian home wouldn't be complete without a dangerous new material, which they inadvertently welcomed into their homes in an amazing array of objects. The man who invented it was so famous at the time a letter bearing just his name and city would get to him.
Mr. A. Parks, inventor of Parkazine, Birmingham. And it got there.
Birmingham, dubbed the City of 1,000 Inventions, had become a magnet for scientists. And it was here that Parks developed his revolutionary idea.
He took cotton wool, ordinary cotton wool, which he combined with acids and various things, and he discovered how to convert the material into a mouldable material, which we today will call plastic. So we reckon he's the father of plastics.
So we've sort of forgotten about this great British inventor, haven't we?
I know. He was a great inventor too. He had something like 90 patents to his name. Well, he wasn't a very good businessman because the company folded about 2 years later. But his idea was so good, it was picked up in the States by a guy called Hyatt. And Hyatt gave it the name Celluloid. And from then on, we've known it as celluloid. We've forgotten Parks, but we all know celluloid as an early material.
It was the Americans who developed it into a business success and started something of a revolution.
It wasn't until 1885 that the world's first really successful plastic product hit the streets, and it was something quite unusual. It was a celluloid collar and cuff, and there's a sociological reason for it, of course. Remember the clerks sitting at those high desks writing away in ledgers all day long, and they wouldn't be allowed to have scrap paper for calculations, so they made calculations on their cuff. Now, they couldn't afford a clean linen collar and cuff every day like their bosses, and they couldn't afford to launder them, so by the end of the week, they must have been chaotic, with numbers going left to right, right to left and backwards. But then along comes celluloid. You can do all the numbers you want on your cuff during the day, take it home at night, put it under the tap, rinse it, shake it dry, put it on again in the morning looking pristine, just like the boss. And it was an amazing sociological success all over the world, 1885.
For as these affordable celluloid products found their way into items all over the house, a terrible discovery was made.
It's a wonderful material, but it's not a perfect material because it's inflammable, it burns. Chemically, it's very similar to gun cotton, and gun cotton we know is an explosive material. So cellulose nitrate, Parkazine, celluloid, it burns very fiercely.
Ignoring its flammability, celluloid was such a useful material that canny manufacturers saw numerous opportunities to produce those must-have items.
When the invention of plastic allowed brooches, hair combs and mirrors to be as ornate and attractive looking as the much more expensive ivory, they were eagerly swept up. The middle classes wanted to look wealthy and modern, and these products allowed them to look just that.
This Victorian evening bag, for example, this looks like a piece of hand-carved ivory, and it's not, it's a piece of pressed celluloid.
It wasn't a real ivory comb, it was made of celluloid, and it wasn't a real wooden bath, it was painted like wood, and that's because the Victorians were so delighted by innovation and by science, and they loved the idea of tricking themselves, and also they loved the idea of a cheap bargain.
Maybe not such a great bargain.
I want to find out just how flammable celluloid really is. This is a ping pong ball from China. This is one of the few products in the world that you can still buy that's made of celluloid.
Assisting me is Martin Shipp from Building Research Establishment. Martin, the flame, please. Wow, a surprisingly fierce flame. Definitely not something to try at home. Martin estimates that celluloid is 5 times more flammable than plywood. Celluloid's chemical composition meant it could not only go up in flames easily, but it was also unreliable in other ways.
Over time it degrades. Light and chemicals can cause it to gradually break down. And in that breakdown process, it releases camphor and it releases alcohols and other things that are flammable. And those flammable gases in the atmosphere can then be ignited by a spark or a flame without anybody igniting the celluloid itself. That's what made celluloid so dangerous.
And there were other problems too. Celluloid items could also spontaneously combust, as this cartoon of the time illustrates. And billiard balls, traditionally made of ivory, were now made from the cheaper celluloid, until it was discovered that they would explode on impact.
This is an example of one of the very first billiard balls made from cellulose nitrate. And the inventor of this billiard ball had a letter from a Colorado saloon keeper that he didn't mind when the balls crashed together sometime. They got a mini explosion because it was an explosive material. But what he did object to was the fact that every man in the room turned around and pulled out a gun.
But even worse was to come. Celluloid was so versatile, it replaced materials like ivory and bone in clothing, items like corsets and lace, brooches, bracelets, and all sorts of accessories were either made of or featured celluloid, without concern for the accumulative effect.
This is a hair comb used in the 1890s, and the fashion and style was to have a hair comb pushed in the back. Not just one, but several of them. And when you consider that's a highly flammable material, and the reports of people passing too close to gas lamps or leaning too close to the fire, and poof, they burst into flames.
There were terrible tales of misadventure, like the woman who failed to notice a cigar roll under her celluloid-enhanced dress until it was too late.
She immediately ran outside to try and get away from the smoke. Unfortunately, that change in conditions from fairly restricted within a small area within a home to outside where there's a lot of oxygen and some wind, the skirt started to burn with flames, and she was immediately engulfed in flames.
In her pursuit of cut-price fashion, the Victorian woman had been transformed into a walking fire hazard.
Although in 1922 there was an act enforcing better safety in premises where raw celluloid film was stored, there was never any legislation to stop the use of celluloid in fashionable items and in clothing. It was only over the course of the 20th century, as more improved, less flammable plastics were invented, that the use of celluloid declined.
But while its introduction had been a dangerous one, it developed into a far safer product that is still with us. One that a British inventor had been responsible for.
I think you can look around today and virtually everything which you look at or touch or you control, everything you do involves plastics. It controls our lives today, which you may think is a good thing or a bad thing, but it does. We can't avoid that. And he set the wheels in motion for that. He laid the foundations for a massive industry which now controls and affects everybody's lives throughout the world.
From the food they ate, to the clothes they wore, and the gadgets and products championed by the new exciting advertising campaigns, Victorian homes were brimming with killers. They lay dormant until scientific progress, consumer concern, or a brave new pioneer raised their voice above the clamour and forced a change for the better. But the Victorian ideal of safe as houses was never really fulfilled.
Many of the domestic fatalities of late Victorian Britain can be explained by middle-class desires to make their lives easier, cheaper and more convenient, and to conform to ideals of morality and respectability. But we mustn't forget that they were pioneers, and progress always comes at a cost. As the century reached its close, Britain was leading the world and was on the verge of a golden age in which scientific advances would really start to make a difference. But would the Edwardian home be any safer?
Next time, I'll be discovering how a new century, a new monarch, and extraordinary new inventions would have an impact on the Edwardian home.
She covered her face in poison.
Absolutely lethal.
The dawn of a new century and the reign of a new king, Edward VII, ushered in an age of dramatic scientific changes, stunning new inventions, and groundbreaking discoveries. And it was in their homes that Edwardians experienced the full impact of this leap forward into modernity.
It offered a brave new world, but these mod cons were all untried and untested, and soon turned the Edwardian home into a hazardous place to be.
Absolutely lethal.
She covered her face in poison.
Vogue was advertising arsenic soap for that offending pimple.
products that were brilliant, maybe not so brilliant, and downright dangerous.
Because they're so fine, they're easy to inhale. When you breathe in, they can get deep into the lungs and they stick there.
I'm going to search out these hidden killers and reveal how science both created them and then solved the problems they caused.
Welcome to the perilous world of the real Edwardian home. This is a typical house of the Edwardian period. It not only looked more modern than the houses of the Victorians, it even sounded different.
Queen Victoria died in 1901. Her son, Edward VII, became king, and the era that bore his name began as the new century got underway. And it seemed as though a world of opportunity was opening up.
H.G. Wells summed up the spirit of the age perfectly when he wrote that Queen Victoria, like a great paperweight, sat on men's minds, and when she was removed, their ideas blew all over the place, haphazardly. In other words, her death created the perfect conditions for new ideas to flourish, and this, of course, had an impact on the home.
In the first 5 years of Edward VII's reign, over 140,000 British patents were granted.
But if that's your blooming game, I intend to do the same. Put a little of what you fancy does me good.
Like the Victorians before them, the new Edwardian middle classes had the spare cash to purchase products that would make their home lives more comfortable. The most exciting new invention on the market was electricity. It would not only transform every room of the Edwardian house, but it would make possible a whole host of new domestic inventions and gadgets.
If there's one thing we take for granted, it's that this works. But imagine how incredible it must have been when it was introduced. This clean, invisible, magical energy that transformed the Edwardian evening into day. So what problems could there possibly be?
Electricity in our modern homes is subject to all kinds of regulations, but the unsuspecting Edwardian had no idea what damage it could do.
When it was first invented, it was considered to be quite magical. It was clean, of course, and it was, I guess they thought it was safe, and it meant they could do things that they couldn't do before. They could put on a light at the turn of a switch. It completely transformed the amenities within the ordinary domestic house.
It was in the late 19th century that the components needed for electrification began to be developed. The vital invention was made by both Joseph Swan in Britain and Thomas Edison in America, the incandescent light bulb. Streetlights came first, and then in the Edwardian period, individual companies began to produce electricity to offer to domestic households. Gas lighting and heating had become popular in Victorian times, but it was a dirty source. As well as being potentially explosive, it left a residue of grime. Electric light seemed to offer the perfect alternative.
It might seem an obvious thing that electricity should replace gas, but at the time, electricity companies and gas companies were very much in competition.
People had just got used to gas lighting, and now they're faced with a new technology, something else which they've been told to sort of take on and adopt in their lives. This is instructions about how you'd use your Edison electric light. And it says, do not attempt to light with match, simply turn key on wall by the door. Sounds quite bonkers to us today that you have to explain it in that way. We know how we operate our electricity, we know we go to the light switch, but then that wasn't so obvious.
At the turn of the century, electricity was far more expensive than gas, but it was heavily marketed by the supply companies who could see the possibilities and the profits.
We get key figures like Lord and Lady Randolph Churchill choose to have it in their homes, and this is sort of widely reported in the press, so it becomes more attractive and almost glamorous for some of the middle classes to take it on.
The newspapers were full of the wonders of electricity. For example, the Dundee Courier in December 1906 praised its romantic story and said that its rapid advance is more wonderful than any tale of wild Arabian fiction.
It seemed chic, modern and desirable.
If you were a sophisticated, urban, up-to-date family, you needed electricity in your house, you needed electric lamps, and those who didn't have it were simply seen as behind the times. So if you really wanted to show off to your business associates that you were the right type of person, you brought in the electric light.
And so gradually, Edwardian homes began to be lit by electricity. But it was a completely new, little understood force. And electricity cables were just that, naked, bare cables. One touch, and you could be electrocuted.
Early cases, the cables weren't actually insulated at all. They used to just run through wooden runners, and then they'd just be bare, running around the properties.
When they did catch on to insulation, they used the wrong material.
Originally, they were made just lined in paper and lead. A fantastic fire accelerant. Brilliant.
They even tried wrapping it in cloth, they wrapped it up in wood, they wrapped it up in basically anything they thought might stop the electricity getting through and somebody inadvertently touching it.
And earthing, the ability to make a faulty circuit safe by redirecting it to the earth, simply didn't exist.
There was no earth, there was nothing at all. So if you had a small child that could just, run around and touch one of these things, they're absolutely lethal.
Lethal or not, the fearless Edwardians kept inventing and found the new power source could be used for all sorts of domestic appliances. Its full potential could be seen in the electric house, the centrepiece of the 1908 Manchester Electrical Exhibition, the tomorrow's world of its day. And on display were all the must-have items for the ideal Edwardian home. One excited visitor wrote a postcard about their visit.
I went to the electrical exhibition last week and spent a very enjoyable afternoon. Kettles boiling and frying pans on the go, all on a clean table without a speck of dust.
What sort of items were available?
A whole range of things that we see now and we find a commonplace in our homes today, but also a whole other range of things which maybe we're not so familiar with.
All sorts of weird and wonderful appliances appeared, some of which had not been seen before or since, as suppliers tried to generate a demand for electricity beyond the electric light.
What's this?
That's actually an early electric curling tong, and you just put your curling tong in there to heat up.
And this must have been quite a breakthrough to have an electric iron for the first time.
Up until now, irons had been heated on coal stoves.
In many ways, I guess that is quite a breakthrough and one of the appliances that people probably were most fond of in the early days.
A look at the magazines and papers of the time reveals a fundamental lack of understanding about how to use electricity safely, even by some manufacturers.
In the Evening Telegraph of December 1908, it recommended the use of an electric tablecloth, a device which it says up-to-date hostesses will not be long in taking advantage of.
One of the most unusual items is probably this one here. This is a tablecloth, it's an illuminating tablecloth, and the idea is that you turn it the other way round, so you'd have this side showing. And wired up inside here are just bare wire connectors. You'd lay it down, you'd cover it with your cloth, basically plug your lamp on the base
into the tablecloth?
Directly into the tablecloth. You're pronging through and making that connection.
I can see that's quite fun, but presumably it's also really dangerous. I mean, if you spill something...
Yes, extremely dangerous.
Whoever in their right mind thought up of putting a tablecloth which stores water and food and all the rest of it and run electricity through it was beyond me. But it was It was new. That's what you need to do, and it was sold and marketed as being the new technology, lamps that are on the table.
Thankfully, despite the marketing, this electrical wonder did not catch on. They had the goods, but they didn't have the infrastructure we have today. And here lay the problem.
They would use the light socket to run all sorts of pieces of equipment, possibly even electric heaters. Now,
from the wire going to the light?
That's right, yes. They would put an adapter into the light socket. They would then run a bulb plus another piece of equipment off that. And in extreme cases, they would add a number of adapters and have a number of different sorts of pieces of equipment coming off the light circuit. And then you would get this whole sort of cascade of adapters coming out from the ceiling fitting, what we call a Christmas tree, leading to lots of different pieces of equipment. So, for example, people would be doing ironing off the lighting circuit. They would maybe have an electric heater running off the lighting circuit. And, of course, every extra piece of equipment was adding an additional energy load to the system, which is why we would get overheating of the system and potential fires.
Because whenever they plugged lights in, or toasters or refrigerators, they used to overheat. And the current that would be running through the cable would start melting the cable, and then this cable would catch fire.
To demonstrate how quickly overloading can cause a fire, Martin applies a battery to wire wall. The battery is too high a voltage for the wire, mirroring what might have happened in the Edwardian home when extra appliances were added to the electric light socket. This overloading of one circuit is what caused fires in Edwardian homes.
It wasn't safety regulated in the way ours is now. There were no consumer units, miniature circuit breakers, or any of that safety equipment that we now rely on.
Modern fuse boxes protect homes from this. As soon as the system becomes overloaded, it cuts out. But back then, the electricity would keep flowing.
There would be a fire in the house, and knowing your luck, you'll be in bed when it happens, and there'd be no getting out.
Although the Institution of Electrical Engineers issued its first wiring regulations in 1882, they were often ignored. Part of the problem was that initially, electricity was sold by individual local companies, who each supplied a particular voltage of electricity to their local area. So an iron used at home in Manchester wouldn't be compatible with one in Liverpool.
It was down to the individual generating company what voltage and what ampage they put the electricity into the properties. So even though you understood one system, it didn't mean that if you went further down the road and bought the electricity from somebody else, it would be exactly the same.
On its own, and left alone, electricity isn't overly dangerous. It's when you bring in the human factor, that's when electricity becomes dangerous.
There were countless stories in the newspapers of the many and varied ways people had managed unwittingly to electrocute themselves.
He accidentally touched the main and, receiving the full force of the current, was killed on the spot.
The deceased, while larking, swung himself upon an electric light bracket which broke, and the electric current passed through his body.
Being electrocuted, the effects of that depend on several things: the current, the duration of the electric shock that you have, and also the voltage. If you have a very low current electric shock, for a sufficient duration, it can affect the beating of the heart. If you disturb that electrical flow around the heart, each of the individual heart muscles can contract individually, and so there's no concerted effort. And so no blood would be pumped around the body. So damaging the heart with an electric shock is particularly dangerous, and that can happen even at quite a low current. If you have a very high current, you typically get a burn where the electricity enters and possibly leaves the body, and that may cause instant death as it causes the heart to stop.
The Though slow to address the dangers of electricity, Edwardians credited it with all kinds of health-giving properties, which led to some strange practices.
What is that? It's got a sort of space-age element to it, hasn't it?
Doesn't
It's
it?
well used. It's an early sunray lamp. It was meant to encourage sort of good health. The theory was that this would make you healthier, and there are adverts from a bit later on where they show babies positioned in front of these.
The therapeutic use of electricity also extended into the medical profession, where it was applied to a range of physical and mental illnesses.
Have you got any other surprising items?
Yes, there are some surprising items. This is a fairly early massage machine, electric massage machine. It's a bit like a ray gun, I think, that one.
It does look a bit like a ray gun. Or a sort of a microphone. You think Elvis. And this is for massage?
Ostensibly for massage. It was often used for more intimate sort of purposes as well, but it was sold as an electric massage machine.
Right, OK.
Some of the things Edwardians got up to in their own homes revealed how little they understood this deadly force. To my amazement, I even found an extraordinary headline in the Daily Mail. A man accidentally electrocuted himself during his daily beautifying routine. He was using an electrical gadget which was plugged in at the mains and was designed to enhance and inflate his pecs.
A man's fatal vanity. He attached the needle wire to the electric light, worked the needle over his breast, and dropped dead.
Eventually, the Edwardians were given the option of a wall socket instead of the light, but this brought up another issue. At the time, both the plug and the socket contained metal, which created a small spark when they came into contact.
The spark is typical of any piece of equipment which is being plugged in or plugged out when the equipment is live. So as two pieces of metal come into contact or come out of contact when they are live, then a spark will occur.
As most Edwardian homes were still using a lot of gas, which was prone to leaking, this small spark could be enough to cause a big explosion.
Explosion just waiting to happen from the tiniest amount of gas, and your windows and doors, and you will be on the street waiting for the undertaker, I would imagine.
Over time, improvements were applied that lessened the dangers.
It wasn't until 1908, 1909 that Edison came up with the idea of a rubber socket which went onto a plug which had a fuse in, which obviously saved any shocks when you were touching it. It saved any problems with insulating, and it saved this problem of overheating.
But with its varying currents, assortment of sockets and plugs, no earth or fuse box, Edwardian electricity was a dangerous business, especially as it was often installed and maintained by DIY enthusiasts.
Anyone could really wire up their home, so potentially you've got people not knowing what they're doing, getting into big trouble. Even one of Edison's friends killed himself, electrocuted himself, and that's somebody who knew what he was doing.
By 1915, there were 600 separate electricity suppliers across the country. The demands of war led the government to take steps to set up electricity commissions to make the generation and supply of electricity more efficient.
And then the government actually made a declaration that we would all use the same current, voltage, it would all come through the same way, and it was the start of the grid.
Despite all its early dangers, electricity became the utility of choice for the modern Edwardian. By 1913, most of the 1 million new middle-class homes that had been built in Britain had electricity wired in, and people were learning to use it with care.
Change was not just afoot in technological terms. Edwardian society was also changing dramatically. This was an age of great social reform, and above all, it was an age of female advance.
Although women were still employed in service, other options existed now in factories and shops, which inevitably had an impact on the home.
Increasingly, the Edwardian housewife, particularly the middle and lower class housewife, she really felt she shouldn't have to spend her entire day doing housework. And so there was a real growth of labour-saving devices, of ways in which the Edwardian woman could save her time, could not be doing the drudgery of the old days.
Where technological and social change met was in finding an alternative to an unpleasant chore that had traditionally fallen to women, the building and cleaning up of open coal fires. Anyone who could find a way to dispense with this onerous task was onto a winner. By the turn of the century, in cities particularly, gas and electric fires were rivaling coal. Some of them used a new wonder material. A resilient mineral that was non-flammable, insulating, and provided clean energy. The new material was hailed as a miracle. Its name, asbestos.
Asbestos was seen as a wonderful material because it didn't burn.
It was a very versatile material. You could weave it, which was superb. You could use it as an insulator.
It's good for soundproofing, it's good for thermal efficiency, it was good for fire resistance.
It was really the wonder stuff. It was strong and it was very, very cheap.
Asbestos is naturally occurring and had been used for thousands of years, but never on an industrial scale. By 1909, it was embedded in all sorts of manufacturing processes.
In the late Edwardian period, they were turning 190,000 metric tons of asbestos over. They were mining it. Phenomenal amount coming out of South Africa, Russia, Canada, America, all being imported into Britain and then off to the asbestos factories. Every day was like Christmas Day, because when they walked through the factory, it was snowing and it was asbestos dust.
Edwardians were happily working with what we now know to be a carcinogenic killer. The first person to alert the authorities to the possibility there could be a problem was a factory inspector.
The earliest account of the health hazard of working with asbestos came from Lucy Dean, one of the first female inspectors of factories in the UK. Writing in 1898, she included asbestos work as one of the 4 dusty occupations under observation that year, quote, on account of their easily demonstrated danger to the health of workers.
Dean's report notes that
where the particles are allowed to rise and remain suspended in the air, the effects have been found to be injurious, as might have been expected.
If you look through the records, there are instances around about the late 1800s of actually it was a 19-year-old asbestos worker who they carried out a post-mortem on, and they actually found fibrous substances in his lungs.
Asbestos fibres are very, very fine, about 1/100th of the width of a human hair, so you can't really see them with the naked eye. But because they're so fine, they're easy to inhale. When you breathe in, they can get deep into the lungs and they stick there. Initially, they cause scarring, something called asbestosis, with fibrosis and scarring of the lungs, which starts to replace the normal lung tissue with fibrous scars, which means that the lungs aren't doing their job properly.
But although Dean raised the alarm, her findings were ignored for many years. People might have noticed it caused difficulty with breathing, but nothing was done.
They didn't really know what it was, and they used to just put it down to bronchial problems or, breathing problems of some description. But they were starting to think that there may be something in these new substances that weren't good when they actually mixed with humans.
What the Edwardians didn't appreciate at the time was the exact deadly nature of asbestos. This is what a lung looks like when it's been destroyed by asbestos fibres.
The real danger of asbestos is in causing a particular cancer called mesothelioma. This affects the pleura, and it's an abnormal growth. It can encase the lungs and spread throughout the body. It's almost completely untreatable, and it certainly was in the early part of the 20th century.
Unfortunately, because of its amazing qualities, by now asbestos was being used in all sorts of products throughout the home.
It was actually quite good for lining water tanks. So unfortunately we then put asbestos inside water tanks, and then we were taking water out of the tanks through lead piping with asbestos. And it's a case of how many problems do you want to put in one place and then reap the benefits years down the line?
They started making floor tiles, ceiling tiles. It was lining their boilers. You made gutters out of it. You could make a cistern for your toilet out of it, your toilet seat even.
The amount of applications that asbestos actually had in gutters, in fascia board, in tiles, in Artex, it's in just about everything.
It was the most hidden of hidden killers, sometimes waiting years to do its worst, and to the least suspecting members of the household.
There are quite a few stories of the wives of asbestos workers developing mesothelioma, and that's thought to be because they're washing their husband's clothes and are being exposed to the asbestos fibres in that way. And so it's not just people who work with asbestos who can develop these problems.
The dangers of asbestos in the home were different to the problems in the factory. When asbestos remained undisturbed in the fabric of the building, its fibres would not be released into the air.
It's really disrupting asbestos that causes the problem so that you breathe in the fibres. So you hear today about buildings that have been condemned because they have a lot of asbestos in the walls. That probably wouldn't cause any problem to somebody walking through the building, but if you were to knock it down, those fibres could get into the atmosphere and be breathed in. The other problem with asbestos is it has a long latent period. It can take 20, 30, even 40 years for mesothelioma to develop after exposure. So it wasn't something that happened immediately. It took a long time.
And it took a long time for the danger to be acknowledged in the factories too.
They did a series of post-mortems on 30 people in a factory where only 2 people had actually survived this factory, and they looked for common trends that was the problem, and it was all about this fibrous build-up inside their lungs, and that's when asbestosis actually got its name. It was really where it really came from.
Partly because of cover-ups, partly because of a desire not to know, the dangers of asbestos didn't become public until the 1920s. The first asbestosis diagnosis by the British Medical Journal was not until 1924, and legislation took much longer to follow.
Mrs. Lily Harriott died from fibrosis of the lung caused by inhaling of asbestos dust.
I think sometimes it was ignorance, other times it was for profit. There was so much money to make out of it.
The death rate in factories led to a decline in the use of asbestos, and it is banned today, but it remains hidden in many buildings.
A lot of people don't actually know about the widespread applications of asbestos that are no doubt still in properties today.
Even now, over 100 years later, there are annually more deaths in the UK due to mesothelioma than deaths caused by road accidents. And it could be argued we won't know the final death toll for another 100 years. To this day, asbestos remains a true hidden killer.
This was an age of firsts. Innovations of the Edwardian era include such fantastical breakthroughs as the first powered, sustained, successful flight by a machine heavier than air.
the first mass production of motor cars, the first vacuum cleaners and electric washing machines being manufactured in the UK. In other words, the Edwardians were laying the foundations of our modern world. Lots of these were the big inventions that transformed life outside the home, but there were also the smaller items that made day-to-day domestic life easier and more comfortable, things we take for granted today. All of the items and activities that the modern middle-class Edwardian needed could be bought from these pages. 100 years previously, most of them would probably not have existed, let alone have been available for mass consumption. It's in the kitchen that we find the greatest technological marvels of the Edwardian age, making domestic life easier and sometimes shorter. If you were really up to date and had money to burn, what could be more desirable than a brand new refrigerator?
Food preservation was a major issue in Edwardian times. Initially, they made purpose-built cold cabinets to store food.
They were carved out of timber, lined with sawdust, it could be rabbit fur, and then your item was put inside and packed with ice.
Ice was shipped in from the Arctic and distributed to people's homes, but no matter how well insulated, the ice would not last long.
They wanted some other way of doing it, and technology gave them the answer, I suppose.
So what came after ice? How did we get to the first fridges that used chemicals? To find out, I've come to South Bank University in London to meet refrigeration expert Professor Graham Maidment.
So, is this enormous thing an early fridge?
Yeah, it's an early invention of a fridge, dates probably about 1870, that sort of thing.
This unlikely looking fridge has been rebuilt from early designs. It was never actually manufactured, but is perfect to illustrate the first attempts at refrigeration. When a version did come onto the market, it wasn't cheap.
The earliest commercial fridges, early 20th century, would have been about £700, that sort of price, and compared to a Model T Ford, which was maybe £500, so more expensive than a car.
So early fridges were the plaything of the Edwardian rich and did not become affordable to the masses until much later.
And how did it work?
Refrigeration uses the principle of evaporation of a liquid to gas to produce a cooling effect. And if I can show you the little experiment, in this can we've got some butane, which is a common refrigerant that we use today. If we spray it, you can see it actually produces cooling as it hits the surface and evaporates.
Well, yes. At first it's warm, but then it gets really cold very fast. The evaporating gas draws heat. This is how a fridge works. The Edwardian engineers understood they needed to create a cycle where a gas could evaporate, draw the heat, and return to liquid continuously.
The refrigerant would have been in this pipes here and would have made this small container within here cold.
Just this little thing in the middle here?
Absolutely. I know it's huge, isn't it? The whole machine is massive, just for a small amount of cooling.
Yes, you could have put a pint of milk in there and that's about it.
That's it.
What's all this then?
Well, that's basically making the refrigerant back to a liquid again. We've got a compressor that pumps it. This is a hand-driven one, so you'd have had a servant driving this.
That's a terrible job. That's awful. You'd mean you'd have to be doing this all day, 24 hours a day, in order to keep that pint of milk cold?
Absolutely.
It took time for the technology to develop to cope with the chemicals they knew could work. This prototype was developed before electricity and well before rubber sealants.
You can see here, you know, the sort of components that we would have used, the refrigerant wouldn't have stayed within the system, so it had leaked out.
The trouble was that the early fridges weren't actually sealed fridges. So they used these gases and there would be a certain amount of seepage and leakage from these fridges.
And this is what made the early fridges so hazardous.
The dangers of the early fridges were actually in the chemicals that they used as the refrigeration.
They had ammonia, which was pretty flammable and pretty toxic.
If you breathe in ammonia gas, it's immediately very toxic, so the eyes would start to water, your throat would become sore. It can cause chest pain, difficulty in breathing, and if you have enough of it, it can cause circulatory collapse and even death.
You had sulfur dioxide, which was extremely toxic, and then you had methyl chloride.
Only certain gases will turn from liquid to gas in the way required. Unfortunately, these properties also made them exceptionally dangerous. Gases like methyl chloride also had other uses.
They actually used gases that, in the First World War, unfortunately, used to gas people in the trenches.
He took ill after repairing a burst pipe in a refrigerator. Medical evidence showed that death was directly due to inhaling ammonia fumes.
If you have any length of period being exposed to these gases, then you can get frostbite on the inside of your lungs. Your blood can pool on your heart. You were talking absolutely lethal materials to be using in the fridge.
So not only were they poisonous, but they could be a fire hazard. These chemicals were volatile and could explode under certain conditions.
Caused hundreds of deaths. The ammonia, typical, tiniest of leaks, and there's just an explosion waiting to happen. It would wipe everyone in the room out. It's pretty lethal stuff.
Ether will auto-ignite with a temperature of about 160 degrees C, which is quite a low temperature. And actually there's lots of things in our house that operate with a temperature of 160 degrees C. So switching on a light switch potentially could do that.
So when the Edwardians were introducing all sorts of electric items into their homes, they were putting things that could actually set the ether on fire without a naked flame.
That's right, so that's why it's not a good refrigerant for a domestic fridge.
The proud owners of the first fridges, which by then were electric, were paying a small fortune for a product riddled with dangerous design flaws. Just as well, fridges didn't go into mass production until the 1950s, by which time the technology could control the chemicals. So what do we use now?
We use HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons. We also use some of the old refrigerants as well still. We use ammonia and carbon dioxide, but we can use them in a better way because we've got better materials to contain them.
They're actually sealed fridges now. The systems are actually a closed loop. So you have a compressor, you have the gases inside there. We're starting to use smaller amounts of the gases. They're more efficient, and as long as you actually sort of dispose of them properly, then they can be okay.
So although they were using dangerous substances, they'd hit on something that really worked.
Absolutely, yeah, that's completely right.
I'm going upstairs to the bedroom in search of the next killer. One that particularly affected half the population.
One of the consequences of the liberating social change of the period was that makeup, which the Victorians had denounced as the mark of a loose woman, became increasingly acceptable. The new Edwardian woman needed a little rouge and a dash of lipstick to look up to date.
The desire to look beautiful remains a constant through the ages, but what is considered attractive in each era differs.
The art of beauty, we always want to do the same things. And what distinguishes the Victorian period from the Edwardian period is that in the Victorian period, you were supposed to be perfectly beautiful with no assistance whatsoever. In the Edwardian period, you could use a little bit of help.
By now, makeup was being sold over the counter in the new department stores, and the products were advertised to Edwardian women by actresses famed for their beauty.
actresses were seen as more acceptable by the Edwardians. One particularly famous actress, Lily Langtry, was actually noted very much for her beauty, and she really capitalised on this by lending her name to various beauty products, including face creams in this period.
Lily Langtry here, advertising Pear soap, and she was apparently paid £132, which was exactly what she weighed.
Lily Langtry's beauty was known to have caught the eye of the king, so it became a style to be copied. But beauty came at a cost. Makeup was not subject to any safety testing. Many new products made bogus claims, but were dangerous, and in extreme cases, a killer.
The death of a young girl who had managed to acquire perforation of the stomach through eating raw rice, with a view to improving her complexion.
The Edwardian woman was told to make herself beautiful, to catch her husband and to keep her husband. By doing so, she covered her face in poison.
The dangers began before any makeup had been applied, with face cream.
An Edwardian lady had to have a pure lily-white skin to distinguish herself from the sun-tanned working classes. And some of the most dangerous products are things like this. This is Harriet Hubbard Eyre moth and freckle lotion.
What is that?
Moths were sort of liver spots. It was a 19th century term for liver spots and discolorations on the skin. And a lot of them are well, pretty much camphor, bleach, ammonia, anything you could choose to sort of blanch your skin, because you had to have a pure lily white skin. As late as sort of 1909, Vogue was advertising arsenic wafers, which you would take to get rid of, you know, any poor skin issues, and arsenic soap for that offending pimple.
On top of these layers of poison, they put a dusting of toxic powder.
Poisonous chemicals have very bright and distinctive colours, and so there were lead compounds, for example, that were very white, and so women liked to use it on their skin as part of a face powder, and that would be absorbed through the skin and could cause chronic lead poisoning.
Different things were used for rouge. Cochineal, which was made out of crushed insects, that's fine, but vermilion came from mercury.
Mercury is a heavy metal and it's very bad for the body. It can affect several different organs, particularly the brain, the lungs and the kidneys. It can cause problems with sensation, unable to feel things, maybe unable to see, and can cause you to go mad eventually.
Even the eyes weren't safe.
There was a product for darkening your eyelashes and your eyebrows, which actually made your cornea fall off, and several people went blind.
One of the things that women liked to use in the early 20th century was belladonna. This is obtained from a plant, and when drops are put in the eyes, it makes the pupils dilate, which is meant to signify desire and arousal, and so made women look more attractive. One of the problems with this, of course, is that it's a drug, and when it's absorbed, it can have an effect on the rest of the body. At best, it would probably have caused blurred vision and a dry mouth, and at worst, a very irregular heartbeat and even blindness.
You didn't know what was in these things. There's no description of content or anything like that, because there was no legal obligation to do so.
A lot of new treatments were encouraged at this time, all in the name of beauty. The crowning glory of an Edwardian woman was her hair, and to be truly fashionable it had to be curly, coiffed and big, a process that often destroyed what it was meant to enhance. These elaborate hairstyles took a lot of effort that inevitably led to unsafe practices with horrible consequences.
At the inquest, Dr. Chaldecott stated that the dry shampoo was exceedingly dangerous owing to the impracticability of keeping the fumes away from the customer.
There was a big problem in the Edwardian period of female baldness.
Why were women going bald?
People were using very dangerous hair dyes, which was one of the causes. But the other big cause, I mean, you'd have been fine with your fabulous curls, but everybody curled their hair. And so if you're doing that, so allow me to demonstrate, this would give you a sort of a crimp.
Yes.
For travelling, you might have a little one like that. So you were curling your hair the whole time, and the dangers of burning with this were absolutely extreme.
Tongs like these were heated in the fire and applied straight onto the hair, often burning it off. But worse was to follow.
Carl Nestler came up with the first permanent waving machine in 1906, but not before he'd burnt his wife's hair off twice.
Goodness me.
So definitely, there's a reason for baldness, if ever I saw one.
Messler's Wonder Machine involved wrapping the hair around rods and covering it with alkaline paste and, most dangerously of all, asbestos. Gas was then used to steam the curls tight. It would take 6 hours. It was extremely popular. Once your hair was right, you had the challenge of adding a hat, and so introduced another danger.
Look at that whacking grey hat. You couldn't put your hat on your head without huge hat pins. These were up to 14 inches long, and that was another very dangerous thing, because you've got all that incredibly sort of sharp pointed end. Ladies were banned from wearing unprotected hat pins on omnibuses in case they scratched people. Suffragettes had their hat pins removed when they went into court in case they stabbed people. And Edwardian novelists did do lovely little sort of vignettes of ladies preserving their virtue by stabbing an aggressor and a dirty old man with a hat pin.
Ironically, while she was killing herself to look beautiful, the Edwardian middle-class woman was herself a killer of wildlife.
The biggest killer in the Edwardian home was undoubtedly the Edwardian lady herself, with her taste for hats decorated with the most exotic feathers and sometimes even whole dead birds. Thousands of songbirds, egrets, birds of paradise slaughtered in the name of millinery.
A public outcry led to the end of the fashion for dead birds on hats and to the establishment of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Birds in 1904. Women, however, continued to be the willing victims of the beauty industry.
Bald, blind, burnt, scarred, Edwardian makeup was a dangerous business. In fact, the early 20th century was poised on the verge of the mass production of cosmetics and the explosion of a whole new industry.
One that would test their products first before releasing them on consumers. Standing on the shoulders of their ingenious Victorian forefathers, Edwardian inventors continued to expand the scientific horizon. And yet,
Edwardian optimism was not as unambiguously confident and certain as the heady days of the mid-Victorian period. Things were moving fast, and the speed and consequences of change rightly concerned many commentators. Their great hopes of the future were matched by serious anxieties about what that future might bring, and many of their fears were justified. For their new explosive freedom introduced into the family home some of the biggest killers ever.
When Marie Curie discovered radium in 1898 and won a second Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1911, she not only showed that women could be successful scientists, she also pioneered a new science. In terms of the home, though, the discovery took killers to a nuclear level.
Radium was known as the wonder element, deemed capable of preventing disease and conferring medicinal benefits. It was used by doctors and quacks alike.
Radium first came to the public's attention as a treatment for cancer, But it seemed to give off an energy that could be harnessed in the home in ways Madame Curie could not have imagined when she discovered it. I've come to the University of Surrey's Department of Nuclear Physics to explore radium with Professor Patrick Regan.
So, Paddy, why were people so excited about radium in the early 20th century?
Here is this magic material that appears to come from nowhere. It's a changing of the element uranium, spontaneously apparently changing into another element, this new chemically separated material, radium, and it emanates energy. This is the birth of nuclear physics.
So what is radium, and why is it a problem?
Radium is a radioactive compound, and so most of its effects are due to the radioactivity. It has a very long half-life. That means that it remains radioactive for years and years. And so you don't just swallow a bit and within 10 minutes the radioactivity's gone. It continues to do you harm, probably for the rest of your life. One of the problems is that the body treats radium like calcium, and so it absorbs it into the bones. And that's where the radium does a lot of its damage. It damages the bone marrow, which is the place where our body makes all of the blood cells that it needs. This is called aplastic anemia, when all of the bone marrow is destroyed so that none of your blood products are made, and this is one of the awful side effects of radium.
But this horror had yet to unfold in the early 20th century.
The burgeoning scientific discoveries of the period provided the Edwardians with what seemed, at least at first, as fun.
Radium, as isolated by Marie Curie, was an incredible discovery. It was a really world-changing discovery. What we might see as most important, as in medical use, that wasn't what the Edwardians were interested in. They were delighted by the fact it could create luminous paint.
The public imagination was fired by the idea of radium. Its energy and luminosity thrilled and excited them, leading to a radium craze in Europe in 1903.
Corsets, for example, corsets that kept you warm for anti-rheumatism.
You could buy radium socks, radium underwear. You could get chocolate with radium in it.
Could this be a hidden killer?
Radium was even available in toothpaste and water. It was the energy that radium emitted that made it appeal to the Edwardians. They truly believed that by ingesting radium, the body would absorb this energy. So they used it in everything they could.
They even had radium spas where you could go and relax in the spa water surrounded by radium.
Reports rather strangely also of condoms that had radium included in them.
Men in particular thought luminous paint on their watch faces was pretty thrilling.
So it was absolutely everywhere. Anywhere you looked, they used radium.
It was a magic substance. It was seen as a sort of panacea for everything.
It would be years before the damaging effects of radium were discovered. And it was one particular product that gave us a clue. One of the most popular items to buy for the home at this time was the luminous clock, and it was radium that made it glow in the dark.
Radium on clocks was seen as a safety measure in the home because it meant that if you woke up in the middle of the night and there was a banging downstairs, you would know what time it was immediately from your clock. So they were sold as a safety precaution, as something that would really help you stay safe in the home.
Such was the popularity of the luminous clock, a whole new industry grew up around its manufacture. Young women were employed to paint the dials.
The girls who used to do that used to lick the tips of their brushes to give a fine point, and in doing so they would transfer some of the radium in the paint onto their lips.
It was these working practices that led to the discovery of how fatal radium can be.
Nowadays, we can measure that extremely accurately. So we can measure literally one radioactive decay at a time. As the paint dials would have, we've got a Geiger counter here. So Susie, if you just bring that in.
Using modern-day measuring techniques and this sample of luminous green paint, similar to that of the clock dials, we can show that the paint is producing alpha radiation. But when you place a barrier, similar to the glass on a clock face, between the paint and the Geiger counter, the radiation is reduced, and the damage it will do to the skin will be less.
But putting it in basically attenuates the alpha particles. If alpha particles are external to the body, they do basically no biological damage, or very little biological damage at all. If you ingest radium inside you, it's a bone-seeking chemical. It will go into the surfaces of the bone and it will deposit its radioactive energy into that bone tissue.
This is what happened to the women painting the clock dials.
They developed something called radium jaw, which was necrosis of the bone. The bone was eaten away in their jaw. And it would also then go on to cause all the systemic effects, the effects on the rest of the body. But this radium jaw was very typical of women who worked with radium.
If it deposits enough energy in the right way, it can change the DNA in some of the cells in that region, and that can lead to cancers.
These days, we have a much better understanding of radium, what it is and how to deal with it. The tragic thing is what was known and what was hidden during the Edwardian period.
One of the interesting things about this is that we believe that the people who owned the factories that were using radium and the scientists who were developing it knew of some of the dangers and took great care not to expose themselves to radium. But unfortunately, they didn't take the same precautions with their workers.
That was really one of the first pieces of strong scientific empirical evidence that ingestion of radium was deleterious to health.
They even tried to smear the reputation of the women by suggesting that a lot of the problems that they had were due to syphilis and not radium at all.
The damaging and often fatal side effects of radiation exposure were only realised in the late 1920s.
Much of the progress of the Edwardian era still shapes us today, and some of the problems are still with us too.
Over time, though, the killers were gradually unveiled. And as a result, these mod cons and innovations continued to develop. But without this first burst of creativity, we wouldn't be where we are today, or have benefited from the resulting safety measures. With all the new materials and technologies we're exposed to these days, we may well be storing up our own hidden killers for the future.
Nowadays, we think of the Tudor home as an icon of Britishness. Timber framed, maybe thatched, a cottage. Sounds wonderful.
But these quaint, pretty relics of the past belie the revolution in technology that changed them and us.
This is the great age of change. It's one of the reasons we all love the Tudor period so much, because it's the age of discovery, and there's a sense that anything is possible.
One place this change was most evident was in the home. Domestic life was transformed.
But as with anything new, there were risks.
From the new technology that warmed our rooms, to the exotic foods that filled the table.
You're using a luxury to show off, but there's hidden death behind it, I'm afraid.
This feels really naughty.
And the radical treatments introduced to the medicine cabinets. New life-threatening changes made their way into the heart of the Tudor home. With the help of modern science and historic records, I'll investigate what really went on in the Tudor household. I'll find out about the hidden dangers and what killed Tudors in their very own houses.
Welcome to the treacherous world of the real Tudor home.
This house dates from the end of the Tudor age, around 1590. At the time, there was an emergence of people with new wealth who had aspirations for their homes.
This is the house of someone in the middling sort. Those are the middle ranks of society in a pre-capitalist age, before the talk of classes makes any sense. So it's professionals, artisans, yeomen farmers, and in this case, a successful merchant.
The increasingly wealthy people of the middling sort built new kinds of houses, and the unforeseen consequence was that they introduced hidden killers to the home. But how exactly did these beautiful buildings threaten the lives of the merchants and yeomen who inhabited them? Many previously unknown dangers made their way back here from newly discovered distant lands, some arriving directly into their kitchens and dining rooms.
This was an age of discovery that transformed Tudor life, and exploration, conquest, colonisation and trade all had their impact on the Tudor home in various guises.
The middling sort benefited from a boom in trade, prospering from the new markets and goods becoming available. New items and imported luxuries from food to furniture helped make the home more comfortable than ever before.
The Tudor period is definitely the start of a real investment in material things for relatively ordinary people. So there's a huge increase in the number and quality of items that people would have had in their homes, from rich textile hangings and furnishings to more furniture, additional bedding, and many more items of tableware. Costly, showy items like pewter are definitely the kind of thing that you want to invest in and display in the home. It's a way of indicating that you have wealth, you have status. It's part of your sort of self-fashioning of your identity.
And it was in the dining room where the taste for the new and exotic was clearly visible.
Overseas trade brought new goods, potatoes, tomatoes, and the abundance of things that were previously rare, like this. Did you know until the 1540s the English didn't have a word for this colour? And of course it led to the mass production of a substance so valuable and delicious that it would become known as white gold. Oh, not tobacco, sugar.
Sugar had been a fantastically expensive commodity throughout the Middle Ages. But in Tudor times, the price dropped sharply. Through using slave labour, production costs were kept low. So on the back of the slave trade, sugar became an attainable luxury for people of the middling sort. The rather bland medieval diet of bread, pottage, beans, lentils, oats, dairy and eggs, occasional meat, and if absolutely necessary, vegetables, began to be enhanced with sugar.
What's the process by which we could produce sugar?
It comes in to your house looking like this, as a sugar loaf, but it has to be broken up. Someone's got to sit there with a hammer and then a pestle and mortar, and if you want sort of an icing sugar to sprinkle over things, there's a lovely dish which is just a salad of lemons sprinkled with dusted sugar. Well, then some poor lad's got to sit there and push it through a silk sieve. So there's work hours in sugar as well as expense.
Sugar becomes something that's a sort of desirable way of displaying status. So you might use sweet treats at the end of a meal, the banquet course it's known as.
With no sense that sugar could be bad for you, they would even show off and play with sugar, disguising it to look like some other delicacy.
So we've got here a little dish of nuts. There's little sugar shells with a little bit of sugar and almond in the middle, like a marzipan, dusted with cinnamon to give it the nutty colour, and you get to eat a pure sweet.
And what's this?
Well, why on earth did I lay out some bacon on the table when we're supposed to be being spoilt? And bacon is a working man's food, but not in this case. It's been made to look like bacon by dyeing some of the sugar with cochineal and leaving the rest white to look like fat, but it's in fact all sugar.
What are these?
Those are little Tudor roses in sugar, and the middle one, I've covered that in silver leaf. So the one that looks silver is actually pure silver on top.
Wow.
And That's showing your diner's real luxury, because you've taken a luxury ingredient like sugar, put man-hours into it, and then put a precious metal on top as well.
From nowhere, sugar became the must-have item at any well-to-do meal.
What would it have been like to have all the sugar? It must have been really intense.
Yes, I don't think we can really imagine it. We've grown up with sugar all of our lives. It's in most of our food somewhere, even bread. So to go somewhere where your diet has been virtually sugar-free and be given a table full of sugar, I think it's going to be a huge release of energy. Of course, we've got to have wine at a banqueting course, so if you just had sugar and alcohol for the first time, you're going to be buzzing. So why don't you try one of the sugar nuts?
Feels really naughty.
As sugar became more popular and its consumption more widespread, the wealthy, ostentatious sugar lover would have little idea of the trouble that lay ahead. In the Museum of London's storage vaults, Dr. Jelena Beck-Varlet studies the remains of almost 20,000 bodies spanning the city's history. It's a unique resource that reveals changes in disease patterns over time. I've come to see what evidence 16th century teeth can provide for the impact of sugar on our health.
Jelena, tell me about these different skulls. What are they telling us?
Well, what they're showing us and telling us is the changes that we might see in the dentition and dental health. We see a marked change from medieval period, the early medieval period, coming through up until sort of the more recent times. If I just turn this back over here, you can see you've got a lovely set of teeth here.
And this is medieval?
Yeah, so this is early medieval, and I mean they're a fairly young individual. They are an adult, but you can see here that you haven't got any changes of decay. You've got lovely enamel formation. But if we come to this individual, you can see here that you've lost the molars. If you look at the mandible, you can just see there you've just got roots of the teeth where they've just really sort of been rotted away, and the decay has completely destroyed all of the enamel.
So this one's a medieval skull, and this one dates from...
Probably about sort of the mid-16th century, so this is later on, and this is then sort of the time then you've had sugar being introduced, it's more freely available, and you can see the consequences in their teeth.
So in both the upper and the lower jaw, you've got these huge gaps. Imagine how painful it would have been to go through that.
It must have been absolutely horrendous, yes, because I've had toothache and an abscess, and it was absolutely horrible. It was really, really nasty, so to have had that amount of teeth affected must have been absolutely ghastly.
Unfortunately, the methods people in the Tudor period used to clean their teeth didn't really help. In fact, they unwittingly made things worse.
The Tudors would use toothpicks a lot, and they would wipe their teeth with toothcloths, and they would use a variety of powders and pastes and solutions, often with rose water, actually often with sugar or honey in it as well, which is not very helpful with the decay. They would sometimes use alabaster sticks, and with particularly tough stains, they might use a powder which was ground coral and pumice stone, which would also take away the enamel, of course. They also had kissing comforts, which were perfumed sweets, which would take away bad breath but did nothing for the decay.
Tragically, the Tudors had no idea that they were in the grip of what would become a centuries-long addiction.
It's the sweet taste of sugar that attracts us all, but part of the reason for that is that it has an effect on the chemicals of our body. Sugar helps us absorb an amino acid called tryptophan, which is used to make the neurotransmitter serotonin. And this is a chemical that affects the brain to make us feel happy and content. It's one of the, sort of like a pleasure chemical. And so sugar is linked to that. And so it's thought that that's why people like sugar. And that's why it is sometimes described as being addictive.
In 1592, the Tudors began recording deaths and mortality bills. They include all manner of apparent causes, and all the biggest killers make an appearance. Plague, fever, consumption, and surprisingly, teeth are there too.
Bad teeth?
Can you really die from bad teeth?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. Tooth disease can be a killer.
Teeth are deadly. If you've got that amount of decay happening, and that can then also affect the bone, so you can then form an abscess, and if that's then draining internally, you've got all of that poison actually going inside you. That can cause you a lot of problems with your health. Teeth are pretty deadly, actually.
The acids bacteria produce eat into the teeth, allowing infection to take root. Bacteria can then get into the bloodstream and attack other parts of the body. But without antibiotics, there was very little the Tudor dentists could do beyond pulling teeth.
They would have had no understanding at all of the fact that sugar was damaging the rest of the body. So high sugar levels could be predisposing them to develop diseases like diabetes, and then the bacteria from the decaying teeth would be damaging perhaps the heart valves and the kidneys. So it could be causing damage to all of the internal organs, and they would have no idea until it was too late.
So sugar really can be a killer?
Yes, because if you're affected that badly, then it can have that really awful effect on your health, and then cause your demise, cause you to die.
Sugar was a slow burn killer, taking centuries for its true impact to be felt. Now it's considered by some to be responsible for some of the greatest health problems of our time. The biggest danger, though, wasn't what they ate, but the very construction of the home itself. I'm making my way into the main room of the house, on the trail of the next killer. In fact, it's sitting right here, hidden in plain sight. It's not the fireplace, but the chimney. Before the chimney was widely adopted, early Tudor homes, like medieval houses before them, could easily fill up with life-threatening smoke.
The typical Tudor house was a long house then. It was, a great hall house. There was a fire in the centre, a little hole in the roof where it took the smoke away.
These early makeshift vents didn't work well, allowing noxious fumes to build up in the home. The chimney offered a brilliant solution.
The change from having an atmosphere indoors where you're constantly breathing smoke and your eyes are weeping to having one where it's drawing and you've got clean air around you is enormous. And certainly anybody who could afford to would have moved over as soon as he'd got to grips with the idea of this new technology being available.
Not only did the chimney make the home more comfortable, it had a dramatic impact on its overall layout.
Over the course of the Tudor period, with the introduction of, to begin with, quite experimental chimneys, more opportunities become possible for pushing the fire to the side of the room, enclosing the fire. It allows you to subdivide that space, making possible new ideas of privacy and comfort to some extent.
So the chimney ushered in the biggest change to the middling sort's home for many centuries. For the first time, ordinary homes could have an upstairs level, separate rooms to sleep in, a kitchen, and a room to dine in. And each one had its own chimney. It revolutionized domestic life. But these comforts came at a price. The chimney brought a host of hidden dangers. As the century went on, there were regular reports of fires sweeping through whole towns.
In the year 1538, a great and sudden fire happened in the night season, which within the space of 3 hours consumed more than a dozen houses, and 9 persons were burnt to death there.
In the year 1541, a great fire began, which burned so sore that the flame firing the whole house and consuming it was seen all the city over.
1485, Sir John Horlan, together with the parson and his man also burnt in that fire.
And in Shakespeare's birthplace of Stratford-upon-Avon, there were two major fires. One in 1594 that burnt down half the town, and another a year later destroyed the remaining half. To find out what caused these fires, the Tudors examined the construction of the chimney.
In the rush to introduce this new technology, you get a builder in or you do the work yourself, not necessarily to the highest specification. There's no building regulations, so a lot of these early chimneys are built out of really inappropriate materials, timber and wattle, so that's earth.
You could stock your fire and light it. The wood would burn, the sparks would go up the back of the chimney, and then all of a sudden the wicker on the back of the chimney would catch a light. And that could smoulder for hours and hours. You and your family would be fast asleep, and that chimney was burning away unknowingly. And then, of course, that would spread to the roof, and then you wouldn't be getting out of the building then.
As well as using flammable materials in its construction, Tudor builders had yet to work out the basic principles that make a chimney function.
It took quite a while before they realised that you had to have an aperture in the front of the fireplace that was no more than 10 times the narrowest point in the chimney. If you don't do that, then it won't draw properly, you'll get smoke spilling back into the room.
The drawer is the suction effect that quite literally draws smoke and gases away from the fire, up the chimney and out of the house. But if the drawer's not strong enough, smoke lingers in the chimney for far too long, with deadly consequences.
The smoke used to sit about halfway up the chimney, and it would just tumble. Now, anybody that knows anything about fires knows that smoke is unburnt fuel.
Forensic fire expert Emma Wilson can demonstrate the impact of unburnt fuel in a Tudor chimney.
The smoke that is being produced by the fire at the base of the chimney ignites, and all of the smoke that's exiting the chimney begins to flame very quickly.
The smoke itself catches fire?
The smoke catches fire, yes, and I've got an experiment to show you how combustible smoke can be.
Okay, here we go. Whoa!
So without an effective draw, thick soot deposits build up inside the chimney. Smoke hangs around in the flue until the heat builds up to ignition point. It's easy to see this effect in Emma's experimental chimney.
So you can see the gases coming at the top, start to get the ticking. There you are, you've got flames at the top already.
Gosh.
Imagine the effect of these flames on a thatched roof.
So I suppose at first people didn't realise that this happened with chimneys.
No, if you'd never had a chimney before, how would you know that this could happen? How would you know that you had to clean the inside of your chimney? So when people first started using chimneys, I imagine you built it and you thought that was it. Whereas actually, we now know that cleaning your chimney regularly is something you've just got to do to prevent chimney fires from occurring.
In Tudor times, as today, the consequences of fire could be devastating. Pamphlets like this one from 1586 poetically chart the emotional impact of these frequent fires. So the chimney could be lethal.
My joys are departed, my comfort is gone. My people, poor creatures, are mourning in woe.
They describe really horrendous, heartrending experiences of the individuals losing, obviously, their lives, their children, and their property. And there's quite a bit of attention paid in these accounts to the kinds of goods being lost and burned, and a sense of just tremendous ruin and loss.
A rude fellow, by firing up his chimney, procured their casualty.
There are accounts of a third of towns being taken out by these major fires that are sometimes traced back to just one individual not looking after their chimney properly.
So the chimney could be lethal. But the biggest cause of death was not fire itself. Dr. Stephen Gunn is conducting important new research into some 9,000 coroner's inquest records from around the country during this period. These documents are a unique source of statistical data about Tudor life and provide a whole new insight into death in the Tudor home.
We actually, in the coroner's reports, find that there are more house collapses killing people than house fires, because Tudor houses are mostly made out of things that burn quite easily. They're mostly timber framed, but they burn quite slowly, so people have the chance to get out. The problem is they're building chimneys onto houses, and of course chimneys are large structures, so we have chimneys collapsing during fires or when fires are lit inside them.
Brick was the wonder material that distinguished the architecture of the Tudor age. But it turns out that early bricks had a hidden weakness when it comes to the defining feature of a 16th century house.
Coal and wood, they would burn inside a chimney, wood at about 1,000 degrees C, and coal at about 1,200 degrees C. And that was way more than the brick could handle. So the bricks just couldn't handle the heat whatsoever, and they would explode. The mortar that was holding the bricks together would expand, then it would contract, fall out, the bricks would be split, and the chimney would come crashing down.
So, for example, we got an accident in Kent in 1518 with a fire that breaks out at a house in Wingham in Kent. Several men run to put the fire out. Thomas Adams, one of them, is called Arthur Overn, another one. They get to help put the fire out with other people, but again, in the course of the fire, the brick chimney collapses on top of them. So it's actually the collapsing material rather than the fire itself that kills them in the end.
The Tudors gradually came to understand the risks to life and property that chimneys could pose. To tackle the problem, they drew up what were effectively the very first health and safety laws for chimneys.
There are ordinances, for example, issued in Oxford in 1582 that actually make it the responsibility of each individual householder to construct their chimneys and their roofs in appropriate materials. So not thatch for the roof, but tile or slate, and brick or stone for the chimney.
That all chimneys occupied with fire within the said city shall from henceforth be swept 4 times every year, whereupon pain of forfeiture for every time that any chimney shall happen to be fired, 3 shillings 4 to be paid by the owners of the same chimneys so fired.
But even these laws couldn't prevent the Great Fire of London, 84 years later. Despite all the new luxuries of Tudor life and the proliferation of grand, multi-roomed houses, in many ways the house remained firmly lodged in the medieval period. Much of what we think of as the basics of domestic life simply weren't there. For us, there's nothing more fundamental than the utility and convenience of running water. But for the Tudors, there was no such thing as a bathroom or a shower. My next hidden killer lies outside the 4 walls of the house.
The woman of the house, and it almost certainly was the woman, needed to bring every drop of water that the family required to the door. This bucket became a familiar and tedious burden.
Water is a very heavy substance, and so if you've got to acquire it from any distance for your household, that's going to be quite a major part of the effort that's put in during the day.
All sorts of chores that we today do inside our cosy modern homes, the Tudors were forced to do outside, particularly washing and laundry. This meant spending an awful lot of time down at the nearest water source in all weathers, all year round, effectively making them an extension to the home. Because ponds and streams played such a major role in daily life, it's no surprise that they also appear in literature, often lethally.
But long it could not be, till that her garments, heavy with their drink, pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lay to muddy death.
Many of Shakespeare's plays, and much writing of the time, feature characters drowning. And analysis of the coroner's reports reveals, for the first time, the number of deaths due to drowning in the Tudor period.
The biggest contrast with today is the amount of drowning. So in 2010 in the UK, about 2% of accidental deaths were drownings. In our period in the 16th century, it's more like 40%.
Gosh, why so many?
Well, people are exposed to open water in lots and lots of different contexts. The single largest cause is probably fetching water. But then there are lots of other things that people have to do for household purposes that involve going to the water. You have to take animals to water, you often have to travel across water, and of course the other thing is people have to wash their clothes. We've got an accident here with a young woman, she's described as a spinster, so an unmarried woman called Ursula Redsole. This is 1556, and it says she went to a pond, she was washing a little tunic called a petticoat, and she was sitting on a bridge called a plank, and she fell off the plank into the pond and she drowned.
Elizabeth Bennet, collecting wart leaves to put under bread she was baking in the house. The fence broke, she fell into the moat and drowned.
Elizabeth Cormonger, washing linen clothes on the bank of a river. Her feet slipped. She fell into the water and drowned.
Leonard Delane, relieving himself on the verge of a ditch. When he crouched, his feet slipped and he fell backwards into the water.
So why did so many drown, and often in quite shallow water? In the interest of science, I'm donning authentic Tudor garb and heading down to a nearby pool. On a fresh spring morning, the water temperature's around 12 degrees. The coroner's report suggests it was all too easy to slip and fall into the water, with potentially lethal consequences.
And immediately, it's really, really cold. So much so that it's making me gasp. Our first reflex when our body hits cold water is to gasp. You have a sudden intake in air and it's completely involuntary and there's nothing you can do about it. And if you're under the water when that happens, you breathe in water. And as soon as that cold water hits the back of your throat, your larynx, your voice box, it can cause it to go into spasm, and that will effectively suffocate you.
Even in relatively mild weather like this, the water temperature is a shock. My reaction may sound extreme, but the cold really makes me gasp to catch my breath.
Water takes heat away from your body 25 times more quickly than in air of the same temperature. So you very rapidly lose heat from the body, and as soon as that happens, your bodily functions just stop working.
As well as the cold and the shock, it's difficult to keep my balance. My clothes are dragging, getting caught up.
And it's hard to get a footing because it's very slippery, and if you imagine there was any sort of current at all, it would be very easy to go under. And then the difficulty with getting out is that immediately my clothes are getting very heavy. This is all wool and it's getting completely waterlogged.
Wool is uniquely good at absorbing moisture. Under the microscope, it reveals itself to have a surprisingly complex physical and chemical structure. It's made up of two internal layers. While the outer layer is water, dirt and stain repellent, the inner layer is highly absorbent, so wool can take in more moisture than any other fibre before becoming saturated.
Oh my goodness, the clothes have doubled in weight. It's like lifting up a huge bag. Oh.
I'm not just imagining it. Wool can absorb up to 1.5 times its dry weight, which means my clothes are much heavier as I try to get out. I didn't feel it when I was submerged, but as soon as I try to stand up, it's a hefty added burden. It's really not easy, struggling to stand up on slippery mud while freezing cold and weighed down by wet wool. So it was a combination of heavy clothing, slippery banks, and the shock of the cold water that made drowning so prevalent. The Tudors were certainly aware of the problem, and as the 16th century wore on, they began to take precautions.
Towards the end of the Tudor period, people began to put covers on village wells. They fenced off watercourses. They installed water pumps. And as communities worked together to create safe sources of water, so the risk of death by drowning declined.
The idea of the home as something encompassed by four walls is a very modern notion. So much of their domestic life involved the space outside as well as the rooms inside. For the Tudors, instead, the house was open and permeable. Humans and animals tumbled in and out in a colourful, cacophonous mess, from sunrise to sundown.
The famous Dutch humanist Erasmus visited Cambridge, and he was disgusted by the state of the rushes. These were the straw and the hay that they would put on the ground to keep the house warm, to keep the house dry. And he said that occasionally they would change the top layer, but the bottom layer would sometimes stay there for 20-odd years, and it was full of ale, it was full of fish juice, it was full of vomit, it was full of the leakage of men and of dogs and of other abominations not fit to mention.
You'd have somebody who was called a gong farmer who would clean your cesspit out for you. Disease was obviously rife. There was dysentery, cholera, typhoid, three of the biggest ones in the Tudor period, which would kill you no problems at all. So if you went to work one day with a cut on your arm or your leg, and the gentry was going to the toilet and it covered you, it was only a matter of time before one of those diseases came knocking on the door.
In these circumstances, then, it's easy to understand how something as basic and natural as childbirth was very dangerous. Around 20 out of every 1,000 women died in childbirth, in comparison to 8 maternal deaths per 100,000 births in Britain today.
When women give birth, obviously they're very vulnerable to infection. The lining of the womb is a raw wound, and there may be cuts and tears in the genital tract, and all of those give an opportunity for infective organisms like bacteria to get into the bloodstream, and that can be a very dangerous thing. Because people had no idea about how infections were caused, the concept of microorganisms like viruses or bacteria causing disease, that came hundreds of years later.
Infection was a huge hidden killer in Tudor times, as we can understand from the coroner's inquest reports.
That medical context explains why we have many of these accidental deaths, because lots of these are people who cut themselves or break a limb. They might cut themselves on a knife, they might break a leg falling out of a tree in the yard next to their house picking fruit or whatever, and they wouldn't die from that now, but under 16th century circumstances they have infection in a wound or they have a blood clot which causes them problems from a broken leg. And so actually the coroner's inquest reports report them dying 5 days, 10 days, 15 days after the accident, but they still say that the accident was obviously the thing that caused it.
The coroner's reports tell us that between 1558 and 1560, unusual deaths from accidents around the country include
death from crushed testicles after playing games at Christmas,
Wrestling.
falling masonry,
56 deaths were due to archery.
and one to an escaped bear.
But whatever the cause of injury or sickness,
Get ill in the 15th or 16th century and you'd be unlikely to call in a professional doctor, except in extremis. Most people of the middling sort would treat themselves at home using herbs and ingredients from recipes passed down through the generations.
for the Tudor housewife, the medicine cabinet was limited to her knowledge and what was grown locally. In the garden of a home of the middling sort, there would be a special section laid out specifically for growing herbs, remedies for daily ailments. In effect, a Tudor first aid kit.
In a big Tudor house, they would have their own physic garden. And there's a vast early modern what's called a pharmacopoeia, which is a body of herbal knowledge and an understanding of which plants can help you, which plants can heal you, and what conditions they can be used to treat. Now, even the smallest cottage in the village, the person living there will have that same knowledge, even if they don't have the physic garden, but they'll know where to go in their local area to go and pick herbs.
Stuart Peachy is custodian of a small Tudor-style physic garden.
What sort of plants do they think were useful medicinally?
Well, we've got things like tansy here. Now, tansy is useful in springtime about the end of Lent because they thought that the intestinal worms they suffered from was partly a result of all the fish that they'd eaten over that Lenten period. And tansy is very good because it's a relatively mild poison that kills the worms. Next to that, we've got rue. Now, rue is one of a battery of different plants that can be used to induce abortion. Pennyroyal is another one. Lungwort, with its spotted leaves there, that one is good for infections of the lung, easing the chest, and would have been used as a general herb in that area.
So the Tudor garden is really the ultimate in organic natural medicine?
Absolutely. It's free as well, as far as they're concerned.
According to some sources, 150 plants were considered to have useful medicinal qualities, all grown in the garden and prepared in the home.
People have this vast storehouse of medical knowledge and remedies, and they pass them around. And that might be to their families, it might be to their friends and neighbours, and of course when that happens, the medicine spreads out in sort of ever-growing circles. It's also worth remembering that virtually our entire corpus of medical remedies, tablets today, are based on plants. We are still using perhaps the same plants, but we're distilling them, we're using them in the different ways. The power lies within the chemicals in the plants, and that's what worked then and it works now.
But herbal cures weren't without their dangers. Get the dose wrong, and you'd find yourself in trouble.
Many of these plants are safe in small doses and toxic in high doses. For example, something like tansy, which actually was very widely used as a way of purging worms from your body in the springtime. Later in the year, that becomes toxic as the active ingredients build up in concentration, and you can make yourself quite ill with it.
And mixed up with some effective practical cures were some very odd beliefs.
There was this idea that something that looks like the thing you're trying to treat might actually help it. And so there's a plant that's been called pilewort, for example, because its roots look a bit like piles, and this was used to treat hemorrhoids or piles because the plant looked a bit like what it was treating.
These superstitious beliefs, along with the unpredictability of some herbal cures, meant that Tudor medicine always had the potential to go disastrously wrong. But a radical German invention seemed poised to change all of this for the better. Johannes Gutenberg had invented his movable type printing press 40 years before the Tudor era.
One of the things that is changing with medicine at this point is that with the introduction of printing, which occurs just before the start of the Tudor period, it is far easier to disseminate knowledge. People have written books on medicine since classical times, but what you're now seeing is the printed page making that more widely available.
Initially, printing presses were used mainly to produce religious texts, but by the mid-16th century, printers had found a new market, publishing home manuals, a mixture of remedies and recipes.
And these books are enormous. John Gerard's runs to about almost 1,700 pages, profusely illustrated, and designed to enable you to clearly identify the plants and know what their effects are and what the toxicities are to some extent, as well as what the benefits are.
Bestsellers were reprinted over and over again to meet popular demand. Historians estimate that maybe 400,000 medical books were printed altogether in the Tudor period. Suddenly, those who could afford it had access to thousands of recipes in just one book, far beyond their previous knowledge, and all written by a supposed medical expert. At first glance, the books appear to contain no shortage of sound advice, like John Gerard's recommendation against planting deadly nightshade.
If you will follow my counsel, deal not with the same in any case, and banish it from your gardens. 3 boys did eat of the pleasant and beautiful fruit hereof, 2 wherefore died in less than 8 hours after they had eaten them.
These medical books made their way into the Tudor home, where they would have played a pivotal role in everyday life or death.
They're there to help people in the absence of a doctor. They're sort of called things like every man his own physician. And they may be set out by body part, so therefore you just simply leaf your way through and find something that's wrong with you.
But the medical tomes weren't necessarily the wonderful cure-alls they first appeared to be. Some of the recipes found in their pages seem very odd today. This is Andrew Baude's Breviary of Health, a medical treatise that was something of a bestseller in the 16th century. And it includes all sorts of remedies, including this one here for the palsy. So it says, take a fox with all the skin and all the body quartered, and with the heart, liver and lungs, and the fatness of the entrails, stones and kidneys, steepeth it long in running water with calamint balm and caraways, and bathe the patient in the water of it, and the smell of a fox is good for the palsy. To the Tudors, cures like this were rooted in perfectly reasonable ideas about the body and disease.
A living thing, something that has been alive, has what's called an animus, a living spirit. And so if part of you is withered, dying, then it makes a perfect logical sense to use something from something that's been alive and restore the spirit to yourself.
Cures incorporating the blood and bacteria-ridden guts of an animal stood a high chance of being fatal if applied to an open wound. Like this remedy for a sexually transmitted disease.
Nicholas Culpeper's 1618 herbal has a remedy for the clap, which is to kill a chicken, and while it's still warm, to dip your privy parts in it to soothe and calm.
But there was a basic problem with all the cures. They were all based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The trouble with all the recipes and cures in the home manuals is that they're pre-scientific. The Tudors simply didn't know about the bacterial pathogens that cause infection and disease. Their theory of the body was of the 4 humours, 4 key fluids that needed to be kept in balance to remain healthy. Disease was simply thought to be a result of an imbalance of the humours. Nowadays, we know there's no scientific basis for that at all. But if you've got a theory of disease that's simply wrong, how can you cure it? Unfortunately for the Tudors, they believed they were following sound medical advice.
These are scientific men, leaders of the medical world, are writing these texts, and the danger is then that they become effectively gospel.
The knowledge in the books would have been perceived as being at the cutting edge of medicine, and the recipes endured for so long because really effective treatments for infectious disease were still hundreds of years away. Part of the problem was that no one had seen inside the body for centuries. Human dissection had been banned throughout the Middle Ages. But in the 1540s, Henry VIII allowed surgeons to use the bodies of those hanged at the gallows for their medical research. Detailed studies of human anatomy became widely available for the first time, marking the beginnings of scientific inquiry into the body. But they didn't come soon enough to help with our next problem. I'm going upstairs into the bedroom to find our next hidden killer.
People are as promiscuous in the past as they are today. It's certainly socially frowned upon, and all the printed literature and all the religious literature and all the morality says you shouldn't do it, but people still do it. You've only got to look at the court cases and the illegitimacy records and the bastardy bonds to see how many illegitimate children are being born as a result of unmarried sex.
children weren't the only consequences of such activities. In 1497, a disease was recorded in the British Isles for the first time, and its route in seemed to be via the most intimate of acts in the most private place in the home, the bedroom. Hospitals were being deluged with people suffering from a disease they'd never seen before. William Clothes, the doctor in London, noted that every other patient at his hospital had the same symptoms.
In the Hospital of St. Bartholomew, London, among every 20 diseased persons that were taken in, 10 of them had the pox.
William Clothes produced a medical treatise describing the symptoms of the disease. So he talks about it producing pains or aches, ulcers, nodes, and foul scabs with corruption of the bones. Then it goes on here, it talks about venomous pustules, scabs upon the forehead, brows, face, and beard, as about the secret parts. Its cause, he says, was that it was a pestilent infection of filthy lust, a sickness very loathsome, odious, troublesome, and dangerous, a notable testimony of the just wrath of God. We now know that, in fact, these horrific symptoms were caused by a virulent bacterial infection, which we call syphilis. While they may not have understood its bacterial origin, the Tudors knew enough to link its progress to sex.
The symptoms are very manifest, and to a society that's obsessed with signs and symptoms, it's very clear to them how this has come about. The first stage gives the characteristic boils and marks on the sexual organs, so it's seen as a result of sin, of promiscuity.
Many Tudor towns had their bawdy house or brothel, and these certainly aided the spread of the disease. Errant husbands carried the infection right back into the heart of the home, as a poem of the time warns.
A woman that to a whoremonger is wed is in a most desperate case. She scarce dares perform her duty in bed with one of condition so base. For sometimes he's bitten with Turnbull Street fleas, the pox, or some other infectious disease.
Whatever the source of infection, the association with illicit sex meant a sufferer was certain to become a social outcast.
It carried a terrible stigma. If you had syphilis scars, then you were seen as a sinner, you were seen as a prostitute, you were branded a syphilitic whore.
Consequently, the telltale signs of syphilis were sometimes cleverly disguised.
It was a real stigma to have damage to your nose because people knew immediately that you must have late stages of syphilis. And so they even made wooden and metal false noses so that people could try and cover up the damage that syphilis had done.
So you must have really thought, yes.
Here in the Museum of London's Bioarchaeology Department, there's further evidence of the impact of the disease on the city's population. Some of the treaties I've looked at from the 16th century talk about things like ulcers in the head and on the corners of the mouth and things like that. Do you ever come across anything like that?
Yeah, we do. We have an individual here that we can see from their skull that they are actually showing these lesions that we would identify as being associated with the venereal syphilis. You can see here that's incredibly destructive.
And if you imagine this poor soul being alive, there's so much of it eaten away, it's horrific.
It must have been absolutely horrendous because you've got those changes that we can then see obviously now in the dry bone, but then you would have had the changes that would then be expressed in the soft tissues in the skin as sores. We might see the infection affecting your eye, which then can lead to blindness, or also then sort of around the nasal area, and then you can destroy the soft tissues of that part of your face as well.
The bones show how sufferers could have lived with syphilis for decades, the bacteria slowly eating away different parts of the body. And with so many victims, a lot of effort went into finding a remedy. The problem was, all too often, the so-called cures could also finish you off.
This little volume by Close is full of all sorts of remedies for dealing with syphilis. Page after page suggests different cures, which indicates somewhat that none of them worked. And after 40 or 50 pages of these various cures, Close identifies one more. He says this is for the curation of the disease called the French pox, and it's called quicksilver. That is, mercury. Mercury had long been thought of as a useful treatment for skin conditions because it seemed to have a beneficial effect.
From around the 1300s, it had been used to treat skin complaints. So whether it was psoriasis or leprosy or any other sort of infection, they would put mercury on it. And so when they saw that people with syphilis were developing skin lesions, they thought they would use the usual treatment for skin lesions, which was mercury.
Mercury can be administered in all manner of different ways. A man's penis can be injected with mercury. There is a sort of what you might think of as a bit of adulterated underpants, which have been dipped in mercury. You can put those on and that'll do it.
It may have had an effect locally on the area that was being treated, but of course we know that the initial chancre, the first sign of syphilis, would actually heal up and go on its own anyway within several weeks. And so perhaps after several weeks of mercury treatment, if the skin lesion had gone, they would assume it was because of the mercury rather than the natural course of the disease.
Some of the ways Tudor doctors applied mercury to the body were ingenious. I took one of the more complex recipes to a specialist laboratory to analyse its makeup. Baxter's cream was a blend of lard, beeswax, various herbs and elemental mercury.
We mixed it together and surprisingly it actually formed a nice even suspension. We expected to see globules of elemental mercury, but in fact it ended up being a nice silver cream, which is shown here.
Wow.
In the final concentration, it contains 35% of elemental mercury.
35%?
Yes, so huge concentrations.
Why didn't they just put mercury straight onto the skin?
You couldn't apply elemental mercury to the skin because it would just fall off. So this was a method of putting mercury into a cream and then to actually put this on the skin to treat the lesions from the syphilis.
So this is actually very clever. So they've made a way of making a cream so that actually mercury can be absorbed into it and then rubbed into the skin.
Yes, and it also tells us that they are able to make a cream which could be applied to the skin to give the same concentration of pure elemental mercury vapour.
They knew what they were doing.
Yes, they did, yeah. It's incredible that they knew how to do that.
Would it have had an impact?
Well, elemental mercury doesn't actually diffuse through the skin very quickly. About 1% of this cream would go through the skin, but the main hazards are actually due to the inhalation.
That's why we can't take the mercury cream out of a sealed container. It's lethal. When we measure the concentration of mercury vapour coming from the cream, it's off the scale.
At a body temperature, say, of around 34 to 37 degrees centigrade, that would have released a gas phase concentration of about 50 milligrams per metre cubed. And the workroom air limit that we can tolerate today is 0.02. So that's over 2,500 times more concentrated.
Wow, that's extraordinary.
So even if you weren't afflicted, being in the room, administering the treatment would have been hazardous.
Mercury typically affects the nervous system, and so it can cause pins and needles, numbness in the hands, and it can affect all of the nerves. You could start to lose your sense of balance and not be able to tell exactly where you are in relation to the world. But then once it starts to affect the rest of the nervous system, it can get to the brain and it can cause dementia, memory loss, convulsions, and then even death.
So while Tudors showed great invention, they were actually making the bedroom itself a deadly chemical trap, filling it with poisonous vapours.
They would use great doses of it, so much so actually that one doctor said that after examining the bone of someone who died of syphilis, he could see quicksilver quivering underneath it.
And amazingly, even today, historians can't agree on where syphilis came from.
There are a couple of theories. One, that Christopher Columbus brought syphilis back from the New World, and that was the first time it had been introduced to Europe, and that's why it suddenly appeared. But another suggestion is that there was some mutation in the bacterium around that time. It suddenly became much more virulent and destructive and caused this severe disease that suddenly appeared. So nobody really knows.
There would be no effective cure for syphilis until centuries later, with the advent of antibiotics. To treat syphilis properly, and all infection, doctors first needed an accurate understanding of the body and a better theory of disease. They needed equipment. The first microscopes, for example, were developed in the last decade of the Tudor period. Without a doubt, the Tudor century witnessed a revolution in the way people lived their lives. The changes that took place created the Tudor house we know today, with its picturesque beams and fireplaces. New technologies had transformed the fundamental nature of domestic life and had started to usher in the modern age. As with any period of change, there were dangers, some of which took centuries to expose, and some of which are with us still, their roots firmly located in the Tudor age. The shadow of World War II loomed long. There was a desperate need to rebuild bomb-damaged towns and cities because, above all, people wanted a safe place to live and to bring up their families. In the 1950s, the government was under pressure to build new homes and started an ambitious building programme. The time to look forward had come at last, and the British wanted everything around them to reflect that sense of optimism. Into the nation's living rooms and kitchens came bright new materials, man-made fabrics, and labour-saving devices. For the post-war generation of homeowners, domesticity had never been more comfortable. But there were problems. Some of the new products and innovations they welcomed into the home were killers. With the aid of modern science, I'm going to search out these hidden assassins and reveal them.
It is unbelievable.
Just by burning that flame, we're going to produce a deadly gas.
Yes, we are.
The post-war home was the most dangerous place you could be.
Welcome to the hidden killers of the post-war home.
It's a two-storey, three-bedroom, £4,300 house built in the modern manner. Doors slide or fold. There's underfloor electrical heating and many other bright ideas as well.
Gosh, isn't this wonderful? It looks so familiar. It reminds me of the houses of my grandparents. It's so exuberant and optimistic. At the time, it must have felt like living in the height of modernity. Little did they know how dangerous it really was. This was the age of boom and affluent revival, especially for the middle classes, who made up some 15 to 20 million of the population. They were richer than they'd ever been before, and they were spending more than they ever had before. Macmillan was right in 1957 when he said they'd never had it so good. What could be safer than a modern home? I'm going upstairs to find our first hidden killer, to the child's bedroom. Children now had rooms of their own and all sorts of newfangled toys that were designed to be educational and to prepare them for their future careers. So the girls had electric irons and ovens, and the boys had model aircraft and train sets and chemistry sets. Although the odd girl did creep in, look, there's me.
Yeah, I'd had the chemistry set as it came as a Christmas present, and it was only literally an hour before I'd blown it up.
17-year-old Ian Findlay was experimenting with his chemistry set in the living room of his home. There was an explosion. Neighbours heard the bang and ran out to find that the living room window had been blown out. Ian managed to make his way to number 72, where Mrs. K.C. Bell treated an injured arm, put him to bed, and summoned an ambulance.
Chemistry sets throughout the years have reflected many changes in science and society, and never more so than after the Second World War. Young would-be chemists, inspired by the apocalyptic images in the comics of the day and their soldier fathers, could not resist experimenting, with terrifying consequences.
Two 14-year-old pupils were seriously injured on Saturday when an explosion occurred while they were trying to make liquid oxygen.
Well, this is the chemistry set.
Oh my goodness.
I took my vintage chemistry set to Joy Ledger at the Bristol Science Centre to find out just how dangerous this box really was.
So, what's most alarming about it, I suppose?
Copper sulfate would definitely have a hazard warning today. The test tubes are so flimsy. They really are. We wouldn't use anything like this in a lab at school these days. These, heated with a Bunsen burner, wouldn't last very long. They'd melt very quickly.
Bunsen burner?
Yes. Gosh, it's tiny.
And this would go where?
Well,
into the...
Presumably.
Gas supply?
The gas supply. Which is unbelievable that they could actually have, and there must be some sort of tap that turn the gas on and off, so you've got the full force of the gas coming in that would feed the whole cooker, just going through that little flame.
Oh, my goodness.
We decide to read the instruction booklet, always a good idea, only...
There's absolutely no diagrams at all, and actually I think it says up here that you will see there are no diagrams, so then you can be more liberal with your experiment. You can change the apparatus as you feel. I'm just staggered at the lack of instructions. The idea of quantities, concentrations, there's no indication of how much solution to add to each one, no mention of how to dispose of the chemicals at the end. It's just frightening, and there's absolutely no mention of parental supervision.
Still, at least they are clear about what to do if your chemistry kit-loving chum has a problem.
It actually says here that if the clothing of the person is on fire, pull the person down to the floor, or strike them sharply behind the knees so they fall. Cover them with any materials you might have to hand, with rugs, cloths or carpet, etc. And then it says, you will have used your scientific knowledge in the noblest way. You will have applied science to the service of man, with capital letters, and probably saved life. And it says underneath, science is never evil except in wrongly used by man.
Many of the chemicals in chemistry sets were caustic, so they would burn the skin and irritate it, which of course would be particularly dangerous if it got into the eyes. Part of the point of the chemistry sets was that they exploded. They wanted to make these explosions and the bright colours to impress friends and make it look like a magic trick. Explosions could burn, set the hair on fire, set the clothes on fire, damage the eyes, even blind a child. And of course, children wanted to share these with their friends, and they'd think nothing of putting some of the chemicals in their pockets when they went out. And of course, that could burn holes in the material and then in the skin, or even catch fire spontaneously.
With some chemicals, 14-year-old Ian Marori meant to stage some experiments with his home chemistry set. But he put them in his pocket while he went to the pictures with his mother. He was sitting watching the show when his clothes began to smoulder. A man sitting nearby wrapped his coat round the boy to smother the burning clothing. The accident was due to body heat, igniting the chemicals in his pocket.
Today, health and safety regulations are more stringent than they were in 1950s cinemas. So we are wearing goggles to do an experiment to illustrate how lethal this kit could be.
Right, now in here we have the permanganate, which is the chemical we saw in the purple chemical that was in the kit.
Nerish Shah, our lab technician, is going to add glycerol, a clear, odourless liquid that might have been found in the home medicine cabinet, as it was used to treat constipation and sore throats.
Okay. So what we're going to do is just make a little pile of the potassium permanganate in the middle. And then I'm just going to pour on a couple of drops of the glycerol on top. So it sort of looks like nothing's happening. Ah, there we go. Oh.
Oh, wow. Oh, my goodness. It's not necessarily child's play.
So it makes quite a lot of smoke and some beautiful purple flames.
And quite a smell.
Yeah, yeah, a little bit of a smell.
Oh, my word. And and that hesitation, that moment of it looking like nothing's going to happen is the most dangerous thing of all, isn't it?
Well, if I was a child, I'd have moved on to something else by then.
Neris only used a small amount of potassium permanganate and a drop of glycerol. Imagine if we'd been more liberal in the amounts we used.
A warning was sounded at an Epsom inquest today that there are grave dangers in letting children play with chemicals which are in themselves harmless, but in combination may be fatal. John Jesty, aged 15, died in hospital from injuries received in an explosion which also injured a boy companion.
Unsurprisingly, the American chemistry kits were even more spectacular.
There was even an American chemistry set that included uranium dust and a mini Geiger counter so that children could do experiments and measure the radiation. The company didn't stop making it because of the dangers of the dust. It just didn't sell very well. Uranium actually wasn't very exciting. It didn't explode and have puffs of smoke, and nobody wanted to buy it.
Eventually, new laws came in which required the kits to be non-explosive and non-toxic. But it's worth remembering what the chemistry set manufacturers used to say. Experimenter today, scientist tomorrow.
But I think the really interesting thing about chemistry sets, if you interview eminent scientists nowadays, many of them will actually say that it was having a chemistry set as a child that sparked their interest in the science.
I'm in search of our next hidden killer. The 1950s home had benefited from the technological developments of the war. There was a belief suffusing the age that science could transform everything. And it did.
In the 1950s, there was a significant development in the understanding of the science of plastics and polymers. A Nobel Prize was awarded for advances in macromolecular chemistry. Suddenly, all of these things that weren't possible before became possible.
Cheap, pliable, easily made, for better or worse, this was when our love affair with plastics began.
So you have the hard and transparent plastic in the eye holes of the gas masks, and then you have these flexible foam toys, and then you had so many other different plastic objects.
Plastics are made of polymers. The breakthrough was understanding that polymers are very large molecules. What's special about them is that different types of polymers can make hard or soft, flexible or rigid forms. So they can be manufactured into a range of products, from furniture to clothing.
These objects that would previously have been luxury items now began to be mass-produced objects and available to ordinary people. There was, I suppose, a democratisation. It just made things possible for the ordinary person. And they're looking forward to a brighter future and the future of plastics.
One of the things that plastics could make were comfortable new polyurethane sofas. The perfect setting for the 1950s family to relax with a cigarette. These were the days when smoking was part of the background of everyday life. A combination which would prove to be particularly problematic.
Verdicts of death by misadventure were recorded on 3 boys who died in a fire at their home on December 19th. The fire is believed to have been caused by a cigarette dropped onto a settee.
A lighted cigarette ignited a settee. This accident was caused by a householder who fell asleep while smoking, an inexcusable practice.
So Emma, we're not just hanging out in these lovely chairs in this yard for no reason. What are these about?
These are an example of post-war 1950s style furniture. In the post-war period, we began to use polyurethane forms. Polyurethane forms are semi-rigid forms that allow a level of comfort without being permanently compressed, without being very hard. And they allow for a number of different shapes and styles.
So we needed this development in order to have this kind of change in design?
Yes, we did. Polyurethane form sofas are much more comfortable than the early sort of horsehair type and the hardback chairs that we used to have. So there was a big change at that point in time. But that big change came at a cost.
That cost was realised by one unlucky couple.
A 26-year-old Halifax man and his young wife escaped from a smoke-filled bedroom by climbing through a smashed window and down a rope of knotted sheets to the ground. The husband ran barefoot over 200 yards of rough track to his father-in-law's house to call the fire brigade. The fire is believed to have been caused by a cigarette end dropping onto a settee.
Plastic itself as a singular form, it is flammable, but it's not overly flammable. You have to, really hold a light under it to get it going. It's the additive that you put with the plastic to turn it into like a polystyrene or into a foam for a mattress or foam for your settee. So it was usually the additive that was put into it, which was the flammable piece.
That means that those forms and the materials that cover the chairs can be ignited by a cigarette or a match, if you were to drop one, and then they can burn very quickly and very freely.
However, it's not just the fact that these materials caught fire easily, but how they burned that was the problem.
The way that the polyurethane burns is actually in and of itself dangerous. So the foam forms a liquid and it runs down the material and to form a pool underneath. And that pool becomes ignited. So you can have a flowing pool of burning liquid. It's almost like having a flammable liquid fire, like petrol, underneath your sofa. That's how bad it can be.
But that wasn't the only issue.
These substances can give off very toxic fumes. And in fact, if you were in a room with foam that was burning, the cyanide gas that was given off would kill you long before the flames or the heat would.
It wasn't only the new plastic furniture that could cause a problem. Cheap and easy-to-wash plastic clothing caused a sensation when it burst into our wardrobes in the 1950s. Not dangerous in its own right, but in the post-war home environment, it could be lethal.
Edna Cooper, aged 13, received burns when her nitrous caught fire and she was fatally burned. She stood in front of the open gas oven to keep warm while brewing tea for her invalid mother.
There will have been open fires. There may have been electric fires, probably without good guards on them. Some little one-bar fires didn't have guards at all for a while. So certainly there was a lot of different opportunities to get yourself burned.
Nora Rhodes, aged 85, died in hospital from burns and shock received from when her nightdress caught fire in front of an electric fire.
Synthetic clothing, for example, when it starts to burn very dangerously, it melts. And so it's often the melting drops of plastic onto the skin that can cause really severe and deep burns.
The January 1955 issue of Picture Post highlighted the dangers.
There was a serious problem with youngsters, particularly little girls, in front of the fire, wearing lovely frilly nighties, looking ever so sweet. Trouble was, a spark might come out the fire, or they might lean a little bit too close, and whoosh, the nylon nightie would just go up in flames, leaving horrendous burns, or maybe even killing the child. 300 children and old people died each year from burns due to flammable materials, which is something we would just not tolerate today.
The Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents had a campaign to raise awareness. They had noticed the significant difference in the number of incidents between boys and girls. They had a suggestion.
We wanted people to go over to wear pyjamas, which were much neater and tidier around the body, and of course to guard the fire.
In October 1954, an Act of Parliament decreed gas and electric fires must be manufactured with a secure guard. And while furniture today is protected by fire retardant, there are no such rules for pyjamas. Now I'm going to the living room to find our next hidden killer. One of the luxury items that made its way into the house in the early 1950s was the television. The coronation in June 1953 was one of the first events to challenge the supremacy of radio. It turned a fledgling service into the beginning of the mass medium it is today. By 1956, there was a television in every second house. It was designed to fit into the room like a piece of furniture, and the family gathered around it. It's a cosy scene, but one that sometimes had deadly consequences.
Mr. George Skipper, his wife, 7-year-old daughter and mother-in-law escaped unhurt by climbing down a ladder after they were trapped in their burning home. The outbreak originated in a television set which had inadvertently been left switched on and had become overheated.
Insufficient insulation in the loudspeaker of a television set caused the death of Victor Smith, aged 4, in Kegworth. He was found dead near the set at his home.
Some television models had not taken into account just how dangerous the combination of electrical wiring, wood, poor insulation and ventilation could be. The Home Secretary was forced to address the subject and announced,
"A new British standard specification for TV sets, including revised safety precautions in the light of recent experience, was nearing completion."
Public enthusiasm, though, went from strength to strength. In 1959, 10 million television licenses were issued. The mass medium was here to stay. That's the TV sorted. Our next hidden killer could be anywhere in the house. Before the war, most people rented their homes. But during the 1950s, more people were able to buy, as wages grew at a faster rate than house prices. Many were in need of modernisation. And it was almost impossible to get hold of tradesmen because most were tied up with reconstructing war-torn Britain. The only option was to do it yourself. And so an epidemic of home improvement gripped the nation. This was really the DIY generation. Dulux paint went on sale from 1953, Black & Decker started selling to the general public in 1954, and Practical Householder magazine went on sale from October 1955. For the happy householder with time and money on their hands and new materials and technologies at their fingertips, domestic utopia was within reach. The public were increasingly being exposed to all these wonderful things through new magazines and the magic of television.
It was encouraged as a family to get involved. It was like going for a walk in a park. You know, we'll redecorate the bathroom or the lounge, or we'll cut this door, we'll knock this down. And you were encouraged as a family to do it, as a family event.
And why not? The family that DIYs together stays together.
This is the first edition of Practical Householder. And if we take a look at the index, we'll see the range of things people could be doing at home by themselves. So we've got paper hanging, making rugs, concrete paths and floors. So there's an enormous range of...
Building your own bungalow. I mean,
that is incredible.
They're pretty ambitious, aren't they? Goodness me.
They certainly were. People believed they could instill new life into their homes without professional help for a fraction of the price. But they were seemingly oblivious to the perils. The doyen of DIY, Barry Bucknell, was, after all, a reassuring presence. His television programmes on doing it yourself attracted, at their peak, over 7 million viewers.
He had the best TV show on in the 1950s, most watched. He was getting something in the region of 35,000 letters a week. He had 6 or 8 secretaries working for him, just going through the envelopes. That is phenomenal.
I don't know whether you've got a problem like this, a rather ugly old panel door. It's one that can be solved quite simply. You can make it look like this.
You know, he's almost like a hero then, to get people into DIY, get up, get going, change your house, get the light in there, get the colour on the walls, and board up your staircase and paint it, or pull that Victorian fireplace out and board it up, cover that Victorian door up with plywood and paint it, and to transform your house to that one that you might have seen advertised, that brand new one.
And it's looking already very much smoother.
But he later became known to some as Bodger Bucknell. They saw his desire to strip out what he called clutter as the willful destruction of original features.
To lock an internal door.
So he was the driving force behind DIY, but also he caused great problems. I heard stories that they reckon he destroyed more houses than a Luftwaffe because of his changes, his radical changes that he wanted to do in homes.
And that, I think, has certainly changed the appearance of the door, but...
But Barry was a professional. He knew what he was doing. His disciples, however, didn't necessarily have the experience or the skills.
A lot of them feature DIY happening high up on ladders.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
So these look incredibly precarious.
Yeah, this man is holding something very heavy. So it's all a bit of a disaster waiting to happen, isn't it?
Although the magazines don't address health and safety, I think they must definitely have been aware of the dangers. So this is a comic strip that appears in a lot of them. And you can see he's on a set of ladders, painting, but then manages to fall through.
Robert Wise, aged 29, died from injuries received in falling from a ladder while painting the upstairs window of his home. The ladder was too close to the wall and he had fallen backwards.
Mrs. Agnes Hyde, aged 45, was killed when a ladder which her husband was lowering overbalanced and struck her on the head.
But everyone knows that ladders can be treacherous. What they didn't know was that some of these products were toxic. Asbestos was used around the house and garage, with lasting and hideous consequences. New, extra-strong adhesives could be harmful if inhaled.
This contact adhesive was pretty nasty stuff. I remember using it as a young apprentice. First time I used it, I think I spent most of the day floating about a foot off the floor. And the next day, I spent most of the time drinking water and trying to get my throat to calm down and my nostrils to calm down because it burnt all the inside of my nostrils and my throat. It was horrendous stuff.
Manufacturers, realising the public's interest, produced a range of power tools for the DIY enthusiast. A potentially huge market compared to the professional trade. Electric drills were on sale for £5, available to buy in monthly instalments, and advertised as the family favourite. The king of power tools was indeed a must for your home. But these boy toys could be dangerous.
Mr. Guy, aged 27, was found about 15 feet from his houseboat with the electric drill in his hand. Under the conditions in which it was used, in water, it became a lethal weapon. Had he been standing on dry land, he would not have had a shock.
They were selling power tools, which professionals were used to using, but as you as a DIY expert had no training in whatsoever, but were expected to use.
Not all power tools use the safety features we know today.
If you're cutting something and perhaps you've gone into your own leg or you cut your fingers or whatever you've done, it doesn't automatically cut off as soon as you take your feet. You've got to actually look for the switch to turn it off. So the longer you're looking for it, the more damage it's doing to you.
Nothing, it seemed, was out of bounds for the do-it-yourselfers.
A young girl died of electrocution in her bathroom as she touched the electric warming towel rail while standing in the bath. Her father told the inquest into her death that he had installed the rail in the bathroom 5 years before. A faulty adapter failed to earth the appliance.
Perhaps installing your own electric towel rail should not have been on the DIY list of jobs to do in the home.
It was a bit of a problem because people were not necessarily very familiar with wiring. So you would get problems with things badly wired, plugs badly screwed in so that there were bits of wire hanging out the bottom and they weren't properly held, so they would work free and then they could short or catch fire. So there were some problems with electrocution and fire.
Mr. Oliver of West Hartlepool Fire Service said many fires were started through faulty electrical wiring, which was often the work of the amateur electrician.
The public were advised, when it came to electrics, don't do it yourself, use a professional.
They were a lot smarter in those days. I can't imagine any electrician turning up looking like that now. I think I'd probably wonder if he was an electrician if he did.
But our passion for DIY has never waned. Our desire to restore and revitalise marches on, thanks to bank holidays and Barry. Thanks, Barry. I'm going to the kitchen now to find out how one apparently innocuous item of food caused mayhem in the post-war home. The kitchen became so important in this age because it moved from being a private space into a public one. It became a place to entertain guests. And so attention was paid to what this previously hidden room looked like. And of course, it was the woman's place in the home. In October 1955, in Woman's Own, it described the kitchen as the heart and centre of the meaning of home, the place where, day after day, you make with your hands the gifts of love. 14 years of food rationing finally came to an end on the 4th of July 1954, when restrictions on meat and bacon were lifted. Not surprisingly, life in the kitchen suddenly became a whole lot more fun. And gifts of love abounded.
It means, of course, that people are able to get more foodstuffs, a wider range of things, and they're able freely to go out and buy as much as they want. So they can really indulge, if you like, on buying, as much butter as they want to after having really sort of had to live by their ration books for a very long time.
People were excited about the new possibilities with food, and into this gap came cookery writers. Writers like Elizabeth David and Marguerite Patten infused food with passion. Tastes were changing, quite literally, and demand for meat in particular went through the roof.
The ideal for the British family is to have a roast Sunday joint, a beef or possibly lamb. But what happens after 1955 also is that, gradually chicken is brought into the British diet to a much greater extent.
Livestock, like cattle, could simply not be reared quickly enough in the numbers needed to satisfy demand. Chickens, however, could. chickens had accounted for only 1% of British meat consumption in 1950. But now its moment had arrived, thanks to a revolution in modern British agriculture. Intensive rearing and factory farming were introduced, and the resulting cheap chicken meat transformed the British diet.
So in 1954, 5 million table chickens were available for consumption in this country, and by 1959 it's 75 million.
Feeding an extra 70 million birds was a colossal undertaking, and one that could only be achieved by importing grain from other countries. Problem solved then, wasn't it?
In the process of feeding birds and indeed livestock, we are also bringing in imported artificial feeds like ground meat, and these come carrying already a bacterial load. So what you see is that these birds and indeed livestock are being fed salmonella-contaminated food.
So the chickens were infected by what they were eating. And the intensive conditions in which they were kept, processed and packaged aggravated the matter. And then they landed in the post-war kitchen, bred, dead, and ready to be roasted.
An analysis of outbreaks of food poisoning showed that the largest number occurred in the home. Many outbreaks were due to insufficient knowledge by housewives.
Why was this?
The post-war period is the time at which domestic service really disappears from the middle-class homes. So middle-class women sometimes feel rather hard done by because they're having to fend for themselves and do most of the household work and labour for themselves. And of course this might create more problems in the kitchen because of course they would have been obliged to take primary responsibility for cooking and feeding the family, which they may have found difficult if they'd been brought up in a home where all that work had been done by servants.
The housewife plays a cardinal role in this story, partly because she is the person who handles the chicken in the house.
The hapless housewife, 'twas ever thus, tasked with putting food in the mouths of her family, not realising that tonight's supper is already a heaving mass of bacteria, then inadvertently upped the ante even further.
Well into the 50s, you can still buy chicken. Sometimes they are what's called New York dressed, which means that they've got all their guts left in intact. They quite often come still with their heads attached, and the housewife would expect to deal with that at home. She might or might not wash chicken when she gets it home, and she might well not wash her own hands once she'd finished handling the bird.
And as such, she was accidentally spreading this hidden killer throughout the home. I've come to Matthew Averson's laboratory to find out what the post-war chicken cooking housewife didn't know about salmonella. Because salmonella is too deadly to use in this experiment, Matthew has contaminated some chicken with a similar, though thankfully for me, less lethal bacteria. I'm going to show 4 different ways of cleaning my hands after handling the chicken, so we can demonstrate just how pernicious this bacteria was.
So what I want you to do is just touch the chicken, and then we're going to make an imprint of your fingers on this indicator plate.
OK. The first time, I don't clean my hands at all.
And then I'll just lift the lid, and you just put your fingers onto the surface.
After the second time of handling the chicken, I wipe my hands with a paper towel. Not sure this will do the trick.
It makes it feel less slimy, but actually, practically...
Yeah, so when you're touching the meat, it feels slimy, but that's not actually the bacteria. That's just the meat. You don't feel the bacteria.
After the third time of touching the chicken, I wash my hands in lovely, clean water. And lastly, I touch the chicken, then wash thoroughly with soap and water.
It actually takes a huge number of bacteria to infect somebody, particularly if you're healthy, between about 1 million and 1 billion bacteria. But you can't see them, And so the food that you're eating may look, smell and taste completely normal.
OK, Matthew, let's see some results then.
OK, so these are some plates that have been incubated overnight. And this is the first one. So this is with the unwashed hands. So this is just after touching the bacteria. The darker colours are the bacteria. There are so many bacteria on here, you can't see individual colonies, individual spots. There are literally thousands and thousands of bacteria on each finger. After rinsing your hands under the tap, though, that's just simply the act of washing the bacteria down the sink. We're not killing the bacteria at all. You're actually making some significant strides to reducing the numbers. There's still quite a few bacteria, but you can see individual colonies.
The biggest difference of all, though, comes from using soap, which doesn't kill the bacteria.
What soap does is it just improves the ability of us to wash away the bacteria from our skin. So there are still some bacteria.
Matthew estimates that simply wiping your hands reduces the level of contamination by maybe 10 times, while washing your hands with soap reduces contamination by probably 100,000 times.
So in short, if they brought meat into the house that had been contaminated in this way and did anything with it and then didn't wash their hands really thoroughly, it could get everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Not only into your mouth, but also onto the other food that you're preparing, onto the surfaces around you, onto your utensils.
Onto your children.
Onto your children, absolutely.
If somebody eats salmonella-infected food, between a day and 2 days after eating it, you'll start to develop symptoms, and those are likely to be things like diarrhoea, abdominal pain and cramps, and possibly vomiting. Most people who develop salmonella food poisoning would recover within 5 to 7 days. It would be unpleasant, but they wouldn't need any particular treatment. But if you're particularly young, say babies and young children, or old, or if your immune system is suppressed for any other reason, perhaps you've got cancer or some other disease, then you're much more susceptible to really severe infection. And in that case, it's possible that the bacterium could get into the bloodstream and then spread around the body, and then it could affect other areas such as the brain and cause meningitis, which could be fatal, or a septicemia, a blood poisoning.
Today, 60 years later, intensive farming conditions have improved, and successive public health campaigns have resulted in a better understanding of food hygiene in the home. There's no reason why you should be at risk from this particular hidden killer nowadays, is there? I'm off to find our next hidden killer in the bathroom. Amazingly, in 1950, half of all homes had no indoor bathroom. So one of the pivotal changes of this decade was the introduction of this luxurious new room. For the first time, people of all classes were able to have an indoor bathroom. And a surge of interest in bathroom furnishings reflected this rapidly expanding market. This new attitude was summarised in House and Garden magazine at the time. A bathroom is a place to rest your morale, as well as your looks. Bathing became an enjoyable experience, and one to be taken in pleasant, rather than Spartan surroundings. It was a far cry from the old tin bath in front of the fire. But why was it not all that it seemed? In order to understand this, we have to go outside the home and look at an unrelated killer. Air pollution was responsible for an unforgettable event in the early 50s, which led to a major change in how our homes were heated.
We've always had environmental pollution, but it particularly became important in December of 1952, when we had the Great Smog in London. It was said that you couldn't see your feet because the smog was so thick. And it would have been not like the sort of fog that we all understand. It would have been a thick, yellowy brown, smelly, horrible sort of fog. It would make it be very difficult for you to breathe. And the egg smell is from sulfur dioxide, which would combine with water to form sulfuric acid.
The rise in deaths was greater than in the worst week of the cholera epidemic in 1866.
Records show that about 4,000 people died from the smog, although more recently calculations made that up to 12,000, and about 100,000 became ill because of it.
This nightmarish episode produced more civilian casualties in Britain than any single event of the entire Second World War, and was the catalyst for replacing coal fires in the home. And here's the rub.
It'd been a very cold winter, and there was lots of snow on the ground, and so people were burning coal in their homes to try to keep warm. But the weather conditions at the time meant that there was an anticyclone, and that pushed air back down towards the earth, and so the smoke was trapped.
Legislation was introduced to prevent the murderous coal fumes, and
a virtual ban on the open coal fire in hundreds of thousands of houses in big industrial areas can be ordered by local councils.
As homes became less reliant on coal fires, gas appliances were introduced, and into the bathroom came gas boilers and heaters.
In the early 1950s, they brought into the bathroom to produce hot water for your bath. It was a self-contained boiler. Turn the little tap on, and you just empty it into your bath and obviously jump in and enjoy it.
What could be more pleasurable? But there's a problem when you bring a gas boiler into a small enclosed space.
A fireman broke down the door of a gas-filled bathroom and found a 20-year-old nurse slumped in the bath. The pathologist said death was due to carbon monoxide poisoning.
To burn 1 cubic metre of gas, you need around 10 cubic metres of fresh air full of oxygen. The problem occurs when you haven't got enough oxygen, so if you're in a cramped place, the windows are sealed to try and keep the heat in, then the gas will burn to form carbon monoxide, and this is very toxic.
Carbon monoxide is produced by the incomplete burning of fossil fuels. It is dangerous when the boiler is insufficiently sealed and the toxic gases are allowed back into the room rather than exhausted to the atmosphere.
You were in that nice new shiny fitted bathroom. You'd got your door shut, your window shut to keep the drafts out, and you're just sitting there absorbing all this carbon monoxide. You think you're getting nice and relaxed because of the hot water, and it's not, it's the carbon monoxide which is slowly putting you to sleep.
Forensic fire expert Emma Wilson has designed an experiment to show me just how quickly this silent, deadly gas can be produced in a sealed environment. She will use butane gas in a sealed tank to simulate a bathroom with a gas boiler in it. In the corner of the tank is a modern-day carbon monoxide detector alarm that we use in our homes today.
Now, if you will help me pop this on the top so that we can seal the gas in.
As if we're closing the door of our bathroom?
Exactly.
Okay. How are we going to do that?
Just by burning that flame in a sealed environment, we're going to produce a deadly gas.
Yes, we are. As the combustion of the gas becomes less efficient because there's less oxygen, we produce more and more carbon monoxide.
When gas burns normally, 2 oxygen molecules attach to it, making carbon dioxide. When there is less oxygen available, the gas can only attach to 1 molecule, making carbon monoxide, a toxic gas. In addition, the steam from the hot bath interferes with the ability of the flame to burn correctly. And in a sealed room, once the oxygen is used up, it is not replaced. It took just 3 minutes for the carbon monoxide detector alarm to be activated. The sealed tank is now full of poisonous gas.
That's the detector sounding to let us know that carbon monoxide in that compartment is now at a dangerous level.
Right, so nowadays you can put in a detector and you can know about it.
Yes.
And it's, pretty shrieking, but apart from the sound that's telling us it's there, we haven't got any smell, we haven't got any obvious signs of it.
No, none.
Gosh, so you could be sitting there in that bath in your lovely bath, you've shut the doors and windows, you're having time to yourself, your boiler's going, and it's producing this gas that could make you sick and could kill you.
Yes.
I'm slightly blown away by the fact that it's just completely invisible.
Henry Payne, aged 41, was found dead in a bath at his home. He probably inhaled the carbon monoxide first, then slipped into the water. There is no official supervision over installation of gas geysers, the borough coroner was told.
When it's inhaled, our haemoglobin, which is the substance in the blood that carries oxygen from our lungs to all of our tissues where it's needed, the affinity for carbon monoxide is over 200 times more than the affinity for oxygen, which is what that haemoglobin should be carrying. So it means if there's carbon monoxide in the air that you breathe in, it will bind to the haemoglobin. When that haemoglobin passes round to the tissues, it doesn't release any oxygen present, and it doesn't release the carbon monoxide. And so your tissues start to be starved of oxygen. And it's really like suffocating the body from the inside.
It was colourless, tasteless, and odourless. The absolute definition of a hidden killer.
At low doses, carbon monoxide can cause headaches, flu-like symptoms, confusion and dizziness. But if you have a lot of carbon monoxide, it can be rapidly fatal and stop the heart because your entire body is starved of oxygen.
The heating apparatus in the bathroom was criticised at a Dundee inquiry into the death of Peter Moran, aged 25, who was found dead by his father. Police surgeon Dr. Dorwood said, "The method of heating water for a bathroom is a very dangerous one because of the bad vent."
Over the decades, gas appliances have improved, and it is understood that if they are incorrectly installed or not regularly serviced, there can be fatal consequences. Still today, legislation only governs landlords. Homeowners themselves are responsible for keeping their houses safe from this toxic gas. Gas-safe regulations cover the installation of boilers in bathrooms, but even so, there are still around 4,000 cases of carbon monoxide poisoning and 40 deaths every year in Britain. My school friend was one of them. My final hidden killer can be found all over the house, but I'm going in search of the kitchen variety, into the heart of the woman's domain. We have seen how men and their power tools came a cropper. Now we see how the newly on-tap electricity brought considerable danger into the shiny world of appliances. The magazines are full of adverts showing women breezily vacuuming their houses in high heels. One article is even entitled, "Cinderella would have stayed at home if her fairy godmother had first conjured up all this kitchen equipment."
After the Second World War, the main technology that people have in their kitchens is the gas cooker. But we start to get the fridge, we get the vacuum cleaner coming in, also washing machines and also eventually freezers. And these technologies really do make quite a difference to women's everyday lives.
Electrical gadgets had previously been expensive luxuries. Now there was an explosion of new affordable brands, all marketed as taking the drudgery out of housework.
This is an article by Jane Story titled "What Electric Living Means to a Woman." And she says, "For people like myself who have a full-time job, plus a home and family to look after, such labour-saving automatic service is a tremendous boon."
If you think about the domestic labour involved, for example, in the weekly washing day, if you've got, say, a family with a large number of children and you have to sort of wash all of their clothes and dry them by hand, you can imagine just how much difference something like a washing machine really would have made to women's lives.
So this booklet talks about what your Monday to Friday routine of cleaning should be.
Oh gosh, that's quite a heavy workload.
So here we've got vacuum all carpets. A thorough once a week clean with your hoover will clear away any embedded grit.
Yes, but that's on Wednesdays after you've cleaned all the floors and polished where necessary. So actually, it is a 4-week schedule, isn't it? For the housewife who's also going out to work, of course.
Yes.
But these labour-saving devices welcomed with open arms by the housewife, sometimes resulted in undesirable consequences.
Mrs. Haller, aged 25, was found dead at her home 6 weeks after her marriage. A modern electric iron found by her body was produced, and exposed terminals under a broken section pointed out to the coroner.
Unscrupulous manufacturers produced goods that were shoddily made, badly designed, even downright dangerous.
Things like kettles. Somebody came up with a wonderful idea of making a kettle. You plug the lead in, when it got to a certain temperature, it spat the electric lead out. Now, I don't think you need to be a scientist to work this out. There's not that many kettle points in the kitchen. There's obviously one straight right by the side of the sink. You're doing your dishes, your kettle's plugged in, it shoots the power supply straight out, lands in the sink.
People often didn't really understand electricity or their appliances, which led to some horrendous accidents.
Irene Claydon, aged 58, died instantaneously from heart failure caused by an electric shock, caused by the full-sized electric blanket in her bed. An electrical engineer said that it was dangerous to sleep with an electric blanket switched on.
The trouble is people don't bother to read the instructions. So often they think, this doesn't work properly, or I'll stick a knife in and have a poke about. And people were electrocuted through toasters, or toasters caught fire, because they probably didn't use them as they'd been instructed, if they'd ever bothered to read the instructions.
The Courier newspaper in Dundee consulted a local electrician as to the safest way of handling appliances. He told them,
"Electrical appliances used in the home nowadays are safe, if respected and treated with care. The danger of ignorance of these appliances or wear and tear on them has been emphasized recently by a number of burning accidents."
Another solution came from the Electrical Association for Women, who urged that girls should be educated.
For heaven's sake, teach them how to look after the beautiful electrical apparatus they are now getting, so that girls who will be future housewives will at least know the rudiments of how to look after the apparatus.
Education would surely help, but some products were overused and poorly maintained.
They would have dodgy connections, they might spark a bit when you use them. But, it'll be all right, I'll get one next week or when payday comes. But obviously you really did need to keep them maintained and changed, and make sure that you only buy them from a proper electrical retailer.
There could be a high price to pay if you didn't.
Mrs. Montgomery died from an electric shock sustained when using an electric iron. Mr. Montgomery stated that his wife had told him about the electric iron failing and breaking. She had tied the handle with string. "It is a deplorable instance of the dangers of using electric equipment which is not in proper order," commented Sheriff Hamilton.
The Electrical Trades Union reported that
some of these accidents could have been prevented had there been some control over the manufacture of appliances and enforcement of the regulations.
In October 1954, in a debate in the House of Lords on safety in the home, Lord Crook complained of the constant sale of very cheap electrical goods, the use of which is not always understood by the purchaser. Lord Mancroft, though, felt the government had done what it could, and that the final responsibility rests with the individual, the person in the home. Consumers, though, had had enough. They decided that they needed more information in order to look after their own interests. Which magazine was set up in 1957 to provide an independent review of products for consumers. By the time this one was published in 1959, the Consumers Association which produced it had 150,000 members. And this represents a sense that nowadays it wasn't enough to trust manufacturers' claims. Not everything could be taken at face value, and consumers needed someone on their side. Consumer power had its roots in the post-war era and continues today. The post-war years were a period of affluence, euphoria and optimism that led to unprecedented experimentation and development in science and technology. and the home was the crucible of the changes. Such innovation made great breakthroughs in the lives of the post-war generation, but also brought profound and invisible dangers. As consumers became more aware and began to stand up for themselves, manufacturers were increasingly called to account, but such was the faith in science to solve the problems of the future that many of the killers remained undetected for decades. At least we've identified them today, but who knows what we've missed.